Today's show is our second on a time period in Chinese history known as the Century of Humiliation. If you missed part 1, which mostly discusses the 2 Opium Wars in China, the Taiping Rebellion, and various other events which leads us to today's events, then we recommend you might want to go catch up. But if you're just interested in the Boxer Rebellion, today's show might be the one for you. Either way, we hope you enjoy part 2 of our series on China's Century of Humiliation, entitled Boxers Rebel.
There have been 22 Chinese dynasties.
The world will watch their actions in Korea and in late success.
7 of those have lasted longer than the entire history of the United States.
In order to improve Sino-American relations, we must start with matters of principle.
Will they represent their own interests, or will they be the dupes of others?
Such a situation should arise. Sino-American confrontation will not be a question of a few years. It will be of a long duration, but we don't know how many years.
6 of them have lasted as long as the entire history of the United States. So you're talking about a different rhythm.
What's the best lens to look at a society through? Is it a class lens? Should we notice economic differences first between the different demarcations in society we might find, at least on an economic level? Should we look at society through an ethnic or racial lens? Would this help us understand something about this state or nation or culture? We could also look through a generational lens. This is something that Americans do quite often, where one could find a difference in outlook or behavior or belief between different age groups in society. And as I ask this question about lens, I can't divorce myself from the fact that I'm in the process of talking about China's Century of Humiliation, this name that many Chinese have given to the time period that precedes the rise of Chairman Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. This time period for this population earned its name due to the fact that Western powers in the 19th century imposed themselves on China economically, socially, and politically. And when Western powers didn't get what they want, they tended to show up on boats holding guns. And when they did, they forced the Chinese to sit down at the table and sign treaties with the West's best interest in mind, not the greater Chinese population. These were treaties which allowed Western powers to keep pouring opium into China as they'd been doing throughout the course of the early 19th century. These are also treaties in which the Western powers gained a number of concessions from China and took land from Chinese citizens living there. These treaties, for many of the Western powers who received them, also granted citizens of their nation a label known as extraterritoriality, a status which allowed for Western merchants to be treated in China under the law of their own nation, allowing them to evade Chinese courts and Chinese rule of law. All of this degraded the way that the Chinese saw their own society. No longer did it seem reasonable for the Qing dynasty in China, who had held power for hundreds of years, to look at themselves as the rulers of a celestial dynasty. Could we have the humiliated generation? Well, I don't think that would be enough, because there are multiple generations that live through this time period in Chinese history. And the way they respond to this perceived humiliation differs quite a bit. But there's a problem with using generational lines. It's very hard to find them. It's hard to pinpoint when exactly one grouping of a generation breaks from another. But the event we'll cover today, I think, will divide the generations in society for us quite well. On one hand, we'll have the generation of society that holds power before the Boxer Rebellion, and we'll have the generation that holds power after. Or maybe more properly said, we'll have the generation that fights for power after the Boxer Rebellion. This will be a generation that grows up right in the midst of this century of humiliation. A generation that doesn't know a Chinese society that hasn't felt pressure from Western nations, that hasn't experienced this carving of the melon as many Chinese perceive this process of Western incursion and the various concessions that China makes to these Western powers. It'll also be a generation that becomes increasingly dissatisfied with the Qing dynasty's role in this century of humiliation. They'll notice their failure to expel opium from their ports and Westerners from their shores. All failures of the generation that holds power before the Boxer Rebellion. And this generation is one that included the Empress Dowager, otherwise known as the Empress Cixi. It also included Li Hongzhang, one of the great self-strengtheners in China who takes up the process of modernization in an effort to strengthen the Qing dynasty. And this will be the crucial difference between these two generations, which are divided by the Boxer Rebellion. Li Hongzhang and Cixi want to empower the dynasty. Much of the generation that follows and grows up in the time period after the Boxer Rebellion will want to rip it apart and make something new. This will be a generation that will include historical figures that I think the listening audience might be more familiar with. It'll include Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-Shek, Mao Zedong and his allies Lin Biao and Zhou Enlai. But before we can introduce these historical figures into this story, into part 2, we have to go over how the Qing dynasty falls. I think where we left off, we talked about the Empress Cixi seizing power back from the emperor that she placed on the throne. I believe it was the age of 4, right? He was 4 or 5 years old. We have to go back and see how Cixi handles another rebellion, a rebellion that's probably more well-known in the West than the Taiping Rebellion, right? That's the civil war that kicks off in the 1850s in China, precipitated by a person who believed himself to be the brother of Jesus Christ, Hong Jiquan. And this Boxer Rebellion that occurs soon after Cixi reclaims the throne is one that is somewhat similar to the Taiping Rebellion, at least in that it has a lot to do with Christianity. While the Taipangs were championing their own version of Christianity themselves, the Boxers seek to stamp it out. And, we've glossed over to some degree what the relationship has been on the ground between, those in the Chinese population and these Christian missionaries who have continued to flood into China throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. The relationship has not been a good one. Ever since the Taiping Rebellion ended, there have been violent acts committed against Westerners proselytizing in China. And as you might predict, some of these instances are quite odd and somewhat noteworthy. In 1870, French nuns, Catholic French nuns, begin the practice of paying for young, sick children, basically children on their deathbed. They end up paying for these children and taking them into their orphanage and then baptizing them before they die. For obvious religious reasons, this is what they think is the right thing to do. But while these French nuns believe themselves to be doing something holy or to be doing something absolutely necessary, the local Chinese population in Tianjin, a city in the northeast coast of China, they do not take too kindly to this practice, and rumors begin to start flying around about how these French nuns are using the bodies of these children for medical purposes, or they're mutilating the bodies. And this ends up drawing the attention of some Qing officials. When these Qing officials go to inspect the orphanage which these children are being taken to, one of the French officials working there takes some offense to the way this inspection is being conducted. This leads to an argument, which ends with this French official shooting and killing a Qing official. What follows will end up going down in history as the Tianjin Massacre. 17 foreigners are killed, including 10 of the nuns, and they are mutilated in the ways that they thought that these nuns were mutilating children. The French during this time period are somewhat caught up in the Franco-Prussian War. However, they will still receive a large payment in return for this massacre from the Chinese. A few years after this, a British representative who is seeking out new trade opportunities further inland than the British are used to traveling is killed by bandits, or presumably killed by bandits. This leads the Chinese to have to pay the British just like they paid the French. In the early 1890s, there's more problems for European missionaries working on the east coast of China. In one of these towns, there's more anti-Christian riots that break out after yet another rumor about the mistreatment of children by these missionaries starts making its way through the city. After violence begins to erupt, the British send gunboats and will receive yet another payment from the Chinese for their hostile treatment of British citizens. A few years after that, in 1895, a group of young British girls are stabbed to death in their homes in Fujian. Afterwards, their houses burned to the ground. This will lead the Qing dynasty to try and put an end to this type of mistreatment of foreigners. They'll have a number of the rebels who participated in these killings beheaded, others imprisoned for long durations of time, and they'll send down a number of orders which basically are meant to protect these foreigners. And probably not out of any particular respect for the lives of these foreigners, but because the Chinese can't afford to keep paying off Europeans every time a local population rises up and starts killing some of them. And it should be noted that these are certainly not the only instances where we see violence committed against foreigners by local Chinese populations. As Jonathan Fenby notes, in the province of Shandong alone, in the 1890s, we see over 1,000 such incidents where we see either violence or, rather hostile protests take place against Westerners, a lot of the times due to their practice of proselytizing. And the Germans in 1896 exasperate this problem, specifically in Shandong. They're interested in Shandong because they want to protect their coal mines that they're building in the north of China, and they also want to have a harbor for a fleet as to maintain peace and order in China and, peace and order for their companies in China for the foreseeable future. They see what Britain's done by placing gunboats in Chinese harbors and by gaining more territory in China. This seems to only lead to even more territory coming their way in the future, and the Germans went in on this game for obvious reasons. And once the Germans begin to erect churches in Shandong, well, this for many in the Chinese population is the last straw. More uprisings ensue, and they begin to coalesce into what can, more and more be called as a collective movement. They end up calling themselves the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, better known in the West soon as the Boxers. And the name Boxer comes from this idea that these rebels use martial arts. But these martial arts seem to be used for more of a ritualistic purpose than for actually winning any ground battles. The belief here is that these practices which they engage in before fighting battles will leave them immune to the bullets of Westerners. And before we get into what this Boxer Rebellion ends up actually looking like, both for the Chinese Imperial Dynasty and for the Westerners who end up sending in their militaries to fight the Boxers, we should reflect on how bad the timing is here. For Westerners, these Germans, to begin antagonizing this population in Shandong specifically. Lan Jinjiang, author of The Boxer War, a multinational study, he describes Shandong as basically a tinderbox, ready to go up in flames. He writes, quote, "Indeed, the foreign encroachment in Shandong could not have come at a worse time. It coincided with two major natural disasters in the province. First, there was a huge flood in 1898. The Yellow River burst its dikes in August of that year, and 34 counties were affected. Thousands of villagers were underwater. A severe famine ensued. As villagers left their homes to seek whatever food they could, or even such things as leaves, bark, and worms, the social tension was greatly heightened." End quote. Zhang then goes on to describe some of the psychological effects that some of these events might have on the Chinese people who experience them. He continues, quote, After the winter of 1898-1899, nature punished the peasants further. Most of northern China, including Shandong, began to suffer from a severe drought. Flood and drought are both natural calamities, but as Paul Cohen's recent study has shown, they had very different impact upon people's lives. While flood could be explained by a common-sense reading of specific geographical characters of a region, for example, the existence of the intractable Yellow River, drought could not easily be explained by the limited scientific knowledge of the time. Flood was often a sudden event. Drought, however, despite its persistence, was often a non-event. Its effects was gradual since it did not cause immediate loss of life and famine, but the fear of a persistent drought was much stronger. The suspense was greater, for it implied a prolonged suffering if the year's crops were lost. Hence, people's anxiety tended to grow, and other explanations had to be found. End quote. Jian will then go on to explain some of the explanations that the Boxers end up taking on for themselves about this drought and about the predicament that many people in this Shandong region of China are experiencing. He goes on, quote, "In religious China, flood was often considered a real natural disaster, but one that could be alleviated by human intervention and practical measures. Combating drought required divine help, for rainmaking itself was a most important part of religious ritual, practiced regularly at the imperial palaces. Thus, religious superstition was more closely linked to drought than to flood. Inevitably, for the common people, the resentment resulting from drought could easily be directed toward any tangible evidence that was thought to have destroyed the natural balance. The foreign encroachment, the Christian churches, and the construction of railways provided just that evidence. It is not surprising that a dissatisfied population would quickly draw on a fund of anti-foreign sectarian belief to express their discontent." End quote. I found this Paul Cohen study that was cited by the author to be very interesting. This idea that drought has a certain effect on people that, keeps them in waiting. That it sort of has this mystical element to it, especially if you're a part of a society which practices rainmaking, right? What does drought mean if you think that you're somewhat responsible for it? What if you turn to your left and to your right, look outside your window, and everyone's starving? And this brings me to an idea that I've had to confront multiple times when researching for this project. And as a fan of history, yourself, you've probably thought about it as well. What's it like to be deathly hungry and starving? Because when these droughts roll in, the crops fail, which had already been in a terrible situation to begin with due to these floods that have happened before the drought. What is it like to go searching for bark, leaves, and worms to eat? What does it mean when that is your goal for the day? That is a situation which, I hope that most people listening to this podcast have been lucky enough not to go through. But millions of people will go through it during this time period, and millions more will go through it over the course of this entire century. I've read through accounts that discuss how when the leaves, bark, and the worms were nowhere to be found, people started grounding up rocks and eating them and dying because of it. But another element that needs to be added on top of this collective desperation is the Sino-Japanese War. The Sino-Japanese War, one of the effects it had was pulling out many troops who were somewhat responsible for maintaining order in their local provinces, which they operated in. So these troops get pulled out of this region that experiences this massive flood which destroys the harvest, and then on top of that suffers a drought. And the policemen are gone. So in this vacuum, this is sort of when the Boxers first start emerging. And they emerge as, one of these collective local bodies that can maintain order. Kind of like what happened when Hung Ji-Quan is rampaging through the countryside and sieging cities with his Taiping. Initially, the Boxers will focus their efforts on what they're calling bandits, right? So when the military leaves, this opens up the door for all kinds of actors to come in and fill that vacuum. So initially, the Boxers will begin to fill the vacuum left behind by these soldiers departing for the front to fight the Japanese in the First Sino-Japanese War. But they're not the only ones filling this vacuum, right? They're fighting bandits initially. These roving bands of, mostly young men searching for food and plunder. That's who they're fighting initially, but soon these Germans begin encroaching upon Shandong, like I said, at an inopportune time for them. And the Catholic priests and nuns that come along with them, they must seem like aliens. And if you're prone to think that natural disasters could be caused by humans or impiety, well, what do these railroads and these coal mines and these nuns and these priests look like to someone like the Boxers, to someone that thinks, society is somewhat responsible for what's going on here, or at least responsible for bringing back life and food and water and ending the drought? I heard one historian say that this is the last major battle in human history where magic was used. And this historian wasn't suggesting that these Boxers were actually repelling bullets based on their martial arts traditional skills and rituals, but rather that the Boxers actually believed it. He would talk about how these Boxers would recruit, and they would shoot blanks at, incoming young men who weren't necessarily on board yet with the idea that these rituals could stop bullets. So they fired blanks at them. Well, that might reinforce some of what the Boxer, the upper echelon of the Boxers might have been going for. And it might be good here to point out that there really is no one true leader of the Boxers. It's very hard to pin down how exactly this movement got its thrust, how exactly, all of these young men sort of came together, not in a coherent unit as much as in a body. We don't have any records of anyone who participated in this Boxer rebellion as a Boxer. All of these records are coming down from either Westerners, who many of these modern historians of China will criticize for embellishing their tale, and once again, making it Eurocentric. And, the Qing administration, we have records from them, they'll end up supporting the Boxers, and this will be the decision that brings Cixi's power to the ground. So we'll have records from the Qing dynasty, but no one actually operating within the Boxer Rebellion. And this is part of the reason why it's so hard for historians to figure out what exactly is going on with these Boxers. We have evidence of what they did in public and what they talked about, and we have evidence of these rumors that flew around about what these nuns are doing, about what these priests are doing, and what these railroads might mean. But we have no idea what their goal really was other than what we can see from the outside. And more importantly, for telling this story, we have no idea how they managed to, form this body. We have no idea how they managed to actually work together. It's still a mystery for many of the people who spend decades studying this time period. But what we do know about them does suggest very strongly that they wanted to restore the Qing dynasty to, its earlier prestige. And they also wanted the foreign devils gone. Right, I talked earlier about, what the hell does a German priest have in common with your average Chinese peasant? Well, not much, and the reason why we see this word foreign devil come to light so often, at least in my opinion, is because of how alien, right, I'm going to use that word again, how alien these people must seem to the average Chinese peasant who looks at railroads and is astonished by what he's seeing. Or looks at light poles, right? A lot of these guys are really concerned about electrical wiring. We have reports coming in from Manchuria that suggest that when they see, these missionaries with cameras, they think this is some sort of evil spell. This is not a population that is primed for a technological leap into modernity, let's say. And this brings to mind an idea that we've touched on throughout this story also. This idea of what does technology do to an entire population that's not ready for it? We might think that technology provides better connectivity, that it provides the free flow of commerce, that, all of these things are beneficial for everyone in society, and it raises the overall well-being and health and productivity, even. Well, these are the same arguments that the British have used in China for 200 years at this point, and it hasn't gotten them very far. You know, it's interesting. One of the things that Jonathan Pomfret talks about in his book, The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom, you know, he has this section where he talks about Chinese workers who came over to America to help build, you know, the major railroad projects in the American West. And we touched on how they were grossly mistreated. But one of the other things that Pomfret talks about is how you could basically convert the travel time from one coast to the other from months to days. What used to take 6 months now took 6 days. And our initial reaction to this might be, well, great. I don't want to take a horse and buggy across the entire nation if I want to go to California. But, you know, we have to think about a modern scenario that's somewhat similar. What kind of effect will self-driving cars have on the lower classes of American society? Well, many of them overnight will be out of a job. And this is pretty much what happens to the boxers as well. A lot of these men who will end up making up the boxers are men who, you know, basically use a wagon and by hand cart large amounts of goods across the northern countryside. Well, trains coming into the mix will totally eliminate their line of work, just as autonomous driving cars would eliminate the jobs of many Americans today. So it's not all that surprising when one of the first railway lines is officially laid down that the boxers turn to it and begin to rip it apart. This occurs in the summer of 1900, and it's one of the first acts that gets widespread attention for the boxers. And as their numbers swell, they start making their way to Beijing, making their way towards the largest amount of foreigners any of them have probably ever seen. And before we end up cataloging what exactly the boxers are going to be doing in Beijing, we should take a step back to notice what, you know, Western powers and Russia are doing about this, you know, boxer uprising. We've noted in the past that Russia had, after the First Sino-Japanese War, managed to take a huge amount of territory in Manchuria, and they'd been operating in Manchuria for some time now. And you know, the difference between how Russia is approaching China and how France, you know, Germany and Britain and the United States are approaching China is that while Russia is sort of chipping away at the peripheries, these other Western powers are going for ports. They're going along, you know, mostly the eastern coast of China, you know, Beijing, Shanghai, Canton, all these places. Now, the difference here is that because the Russians have been operating along the border of China and have taken new territory in China, they have a more intimate understanding of these uprisings that, you know, begin developing in the 1890s. The Russians are very serious about taking notes on these uprisings and how they're likely to sort of pan out. And from what they can tell, you know, in the spring of 1900, is that these boxers are seemingly most concerned with missionaries living in, you know, the interior of China, or at least further south than Manchuria. So the Russians could stand to benefit from the disruption that these boxers are going to cause in the areas that Britain, Germany, the United States, and England are mostly operating in. They have some insider information about what these boxers are up to. Liang Jinjiang, in his book on the Boxer Rebellion, touches on Russia having this insider information. He writes, quote, "The Boxer movement in Manchuria was directly linked to the Shandong Boxer organizations. Large-scale migration from Shandong to Manchuria had changed the composition of the population. For decades, Manchuria had received large numbers of Shandong natives, mostly poor peasants in search of future and opportunity. These immigrants maintained close links with their roots. By February of 1900, the Boxer rituals had a strong presence in southern Manchuria. Nevertheless, these local troubles were considered minor and manageable. Ivan Korestovitz, diplomatic representative of Admiral E.I. Alexiev, commander of Port Arthur, recorded that in early 1900 the Russians in China were mostly complacent. Most Russians believed that the Boxer riots were directed at missionaries in the interior of the country. Russia had only 3 religious institutions in China and no proselytizing activities of any kind." End quote. So the Russians are in a different position than the other powers in China are. And the Western powers, Germany, France, Britain, the United States, they'll begin to notice that diplomats from Russia working in China are basically trying to break up this coalition of Western governments which are telling the Chinese to do something about these boxers before they get to Beijing. The Russians are, not as interested in getting the government to do something about it because the stakes are not as high for them. And the idea here is that, the Chinese will take this as, the Russians offering protection for them should the Western powers move in to do something about the boxers themselves. A British diplomat working in China named Sir Claude Maxwell MacDonald, he'll send a note to the British Foreign Secretary describing, what the consequences were for Russia's, lack of interest in combining efforts with other Western powers to put down this Boxer Rebellion, or at least to try and convince the Chinese to do it themselves. MacDonald is also writing after the end of the Boxer Rebellion, so he'll foreshadow what's ahead for us in this story. He writes, quote, "If at any time Russia had joined the other five powers and insisted upon the Chinese government treating the Boxer Rising seriously, there would in all probability have been no siege of the legations at Peking." End quote. Another English diplomat named Sir Robert Hart had been working in China probably longer than almost any other Western diplomat had at the time of the Boxer Rebellion. His opinion on the matter is certainly worth noting. He wrote the following, quote, "One set of powers are telling China, if you don't declare those Boxers brigands and put an end to them, we'll do it ourselves and hammer you. While another set reassures China, saying, in genial terms, of this Boxer possibility, we're your friends, and if any other powers touch you, we'll interfere. Although this interference would probably only amount to securing a share of the spoil. China fancies its means, alliance, and protection, so the demand of the first set is not likely to prove effective, and a row may be before us." End quote. And this could be part of the reason why Cixi is so hesitant to denounce these Boxers. As these Western powers begin to notice these Boxers making their way towards Beijing and ripping up railways that they've just laid down, they begin wanting the Chinese government to step up and do something about, this uprising of peasants. But Cixi doesn't comply. Cixi even invites some of these Boxers to the Imperial Palace to demonstrate some of their rituals for, some soldiers working there. But we also have to remember that just in the last few years, Cixi has usurped a very pro-Western, pro-modernization and reform emperor. So her platform in some ways rests on this emotion that is a response to this Western incursion into China. But Cixi is going to play both sides of this Boxer coin. While on one hand, she's going to directly refuse to denounce the Boxers, and she'll invite some of them to her palace, she's also going to install Yuan Shikai as the new governor of Shandong, this place where the Boxer uprising initially took off. And he's going to brutally suppress any Boxer elements he'll find in Shandong. So Cixi can definitely benefit politically from allowing this uprising to continue. However, she has to still be aware of the fact that these Western powers at some point could be irritated enough to take action. But early on in this Boxer uprising, in the spring of 1900, it appears that the British are still the only ones on the ground in China who are threatening any type of action similar to war. At this point in history, Russia and France are both allies, so Russia is likely dissuading France from taking any military action in China. The German government has also said that unless some major force begins sieging some of their missions, that they're not interested in a war either. So as these Western powers are standing by and watching these Boxers move through China and threatening Christians in China, Cixi begins developing a more clear strategy about how to use these Boxers to her advantage. Taking from Zhang's work again, quote, "The dominant court policy during the period from January to May 1900 can be characterized as follows. 1. To officially ban the Boxers who engage in anti-Christian riots. 2. The method was to threaten the use of force, but if the rebels resisted, then an actual military operation would be carried out. 3. To be tolerant of the Boxer organizations that were not engaging in anti-foreign violence." Next, the author goes on to explain some more of the motivations behind Cixi's interest in providing some subtle support for the Boxers. He continues, quote, The favorable attitude towards the Boxers by many members of the Manchu elite was not enough for the Empress Dowager to trust these potential Chinese rebels. She knew the selfish motives of the princelings well. She decided to pay more attention to the opinions of some Chinese mandarins who were strongly in favor of using the Boxers as military auxiliaries. End quote. However, Cixi's window of opportunity to play both sides of this Boxer equation is slowly shrinking. In April of 1900, America, Britain, Germany, and Italy, who also have interests in China, have decided to send warships to China's shores as a way of convincing them to put down this Boxer uprising for good. France, a bit more reluctant than these other powers given their relationship with Russia, eventually goes along with the idea. In that same month, Russia will lend some of its advice to the Chinese dynasty about what to do about these Western powers. Russia's senior foreign official on the ground in China will contact a senior Qing official and tell him the following, quote, "The Boxers have already appeared near the suburbs of Beijing. The situation is very serious." He advised the Chinese, quote, "not to lose the opportunity to suppress the Boxers before they are able to convert government soldiers. Otherwise, the great powers will engage in open military intervention." End quote. And the next day after the Chinese are told this, one of their senior officials will publish an official memorandum in a local Beijing newspaper that describes these Boxers as rebels, which is close to what these Westerners are looking for. The Westerners want a clear denunciation and an imperial decree saying just the same. So while the Chinese have just done something to placate the Westerners, they haven't gone the full way. After this memorandum is published, though, some of the Western powers begin to believe that the Qing dynasty is about to put down this rebellion for sure, that they're going to scrape up whatever's left of these rebels and completely quell the uprising. However, the Chinese, on the other hand, are thinking that, well, okay, these Westerners now seem to believe that we're going to do something more about this. If we look to Shandong, we can see Yuan Shikai brutally putting down any of these Boxers who are, committing violence or any crimes against Westerners or Christians. So we are going to continue with this practice of trying to incorporate these Boxers into our military or get them to be our foot soldiers in some way. But what begins to happen after Yuan Shikai starts moving these Boxers out of Shandong is that they start heading north to the Chile province. And this is an area that has experienced a lot of the same problems that the Shandong province has experienced. But instead of a Boxer uprising that we see in Shandong, in Chile we see more secret societies form that are more based around commerce. We see bandits, societies of bandits that roam the countryside and rob travelers. We see salt smugglers and other sort of gangster-type organizations like this. And once the Boxers are pushed out of Shandong north to Chile, they sort of incorporate themselves, or rather these secret societies begin to incorporate these disaffected Boxers into their own operations. So while these new Boxers in the Chile province lose many of these martial arts practices that the Boxer Rebellion started with, they will pick up some other interesting ideologies. Returning back to one of the sources I found most useful for this Boxer Rebellion, Lan Jinjiang, this is how he describes this newly formed group of quasi-Boxers in Chile. He writes, quote, "These elements that were pushed by Governor Yuan Shikai into Chile were typically scattered in disorganized groups. They merged quickly with Chile natives. The newly formed Chile Boxers were more often than not social classes directly displaced by Western technology in Chile and Shandong. Many were true vagabonds and bandits. Few Boxer chiefs in Chile knew much about martial arts. Shamanism and voodooism were the prevailing features of these organizations. Most secret sects in Chile were led by salt smugglers, horse thieves, fishermen gang members, and boatmen of various secret mafia-like associations. The boatmen saw their lumbering craft rot away on the banks of the rivers because their skill had been superseded by steam navigation. The conductors of caravans or drivers of wagons were unemployed because of railway transportation, which was first established in the Chile area. Even the most traditional post carriers joined the ranks of bandits, for they lost their employment when modern post and telegraphic systems rendered useless their extraordinary ability to ride fast horses." End quote. Zhang will then go on to explain some other differences between this group of Shandong Boxers that initially has to flee from Governor Yuan Shikai to Chile. He describes the difference between this initial set of boxers and the new Chile boxers. He writes, quote, "The Chile boxers decided to ride on the wave of the popularity of the Shandong boxers. Claiming to be representative of the Shandong original boxers, many Chile boxer leaders found it easy to recruit large numbers of peasants. But the Shandong boxers reacted to the foreign encroachment in the province. They often fought over specific issues, such as religious disputes or an impaired local justice system. The Chile boxers, from the outset, aimed at eliminating all foreigners. Their organizations relied heavily on sworn blood relationships, superstition, and religious mysticism." End quote. So rather than focusing specifically on Catholic churches or priests or nuns, these new Chile boxers are interested in eliminating, like he said, all foreigners. And the fervor of this movement will pick up in a way that goes unrecognized by both the Chinese and by Western powers whose citizens in China will soon be facing a force coming from the peasantry. So while Britain, France, Germany, and the United States all believe that this boxer uprising in Shandong has been thoroughly put down and is no longer a threat to their citizens living in China, as their military forces begin to recede, the Russians are still somewhat worried about what's happening on the ground in northern China. They're early to see that just because this Shandong rebellion has been put down, it doesn't mean it hasn't spread somewhere else. This drought is still persisting, people are still starving on the ground, and the boxers have appeared to swell to nearly 100,000 in the Chile province in late spring. Making matters even worse, many of these local officials on the ground in Chile and some of the other nearby provinces where boxers have begun to appear and grow, a lot of these officials are holding some of the funds the central government is sending to help relieve this drought and this famine. They're taking these funds for themselves and filling their pockets. This does nothing to help the peasantry or to help alleviate many of the growing concerns in this boxer rebellion. And around the time that this Shandong boxer rebellion is beginning to get put down and these Westerners are turning away from their worries in China, and the court is beginning to think that, okay, well, we've done a good job so far with these boxers and these Westerners are turning around, maybe we can begin to use them and incorporate them into our military structure. As this is all taking place in late spring of 1900, China's leading military commander, a man named Rong Lu, seeks out a fortune teller who informs him that the next year will be very positive and very good. This is a man who has been very hesitant about this idea of co-opting these boxers. He's been more anti-boxer than most of the other members of the Chinese court who, are influencing Empress Dowager, an already conservative, somewhat pro-boxer politician so far. Right? Cixi has invited these boxers to the Imperial Palace, has given some credibility to their magical beliefs and their ritualistic nature. But Rong, on the other hand, he was heavily involved in having Yuan Shikai installed as the governor of Shandong, the man who brutally puts down these Shandong boxers. And he's also had a lot to do with the viceroy in Chile in his activities and his efforts to try and, chip away at the peripheries of the boxer movement there. He will step away from the scene as these boxers from Shandong are put down and these boxers from Chile are rising, because he'd like to avoid any type of confrontation with Cixi. He doesn't want to be the type of person that's sitting there still telling her that these boxers need to be put away, while she's of the belief that these boxers can still be incorporated into the military. And by taking this leave of absence, Rong will open the door to many of the more pro-boxer elements within the Qing court. And by late May, Rong begins to notice a shift in the way the Qing dynasty is talking about these boxers publicly. In May, an imperial decree will be issued which calls out the imperial army's treatment of these boxers and how they've gone about suppressing them, basically denouncing their actions. Instead of being glad that the government has come out and stated the wrongs that they've helped commit, the Chile boxers begin to rebel even more ferociously. In response, the government picks up its suppression campaigns, which begin more and more to involve the killing of innocents. As these suppression campaigns begin to pick up, we see more evidence of boxer activity in Beijing. We see posters left around the city, which blame a lot of the problem these boxers are facing on foreigners. The drought, the flood, the famine, the general state of the peasantry of Chile and Shandong is being blamed on these foreign devils. These posters begin to turn the heads of many of the diplomats living in Beijing, as does another event which happens on May 17th, 1900. The French get a report that in Chile, 60 Roman Catholics have been killed by Boxers. 3 days later, a similar number are killed elsewhere. But in his second report, this French diplomat who gives this information to the French authorities says that during this uprising, the Boxers had raised a flag which indicates that they're working under the imperial authority. There happened to be no evidence for this, and it appears that this might have been done as a way of convincing the French to step up its military response. If they believe that the imperial flag is being used by the Boxers, well, that might give them sufficient cause to go to war with China. But the reality is that the Chinese are trying to suppress the Boxers. Once they find out that the Westerners are beginning to get more and more concerned about what these Boxers are doing to Christians in China, they really don't want to have to deal with these Westerners again. So they send out some of their troops to deal with them. The problem is that they do a terrible job of doing so. They don't send enough of these troops, and the regiments they send don't deal with the situation very well. This has the effect of causing more and more Boxers to join the fight. And the failure of the imperial troops to put down these Boxers in Chile, well, it has an interesting effect on the imperial court. Taking from Zhang once again, he writes the following, quote, "This incident became an important turning point. It was the only case that involved the death of a ranking government officer during the suppression campaigns. The Manchu court was shocked. It had become quite clear that the Chile Boxers had reached a stage of open rebellion in defying all government decrees. The most ominous aspect was the fact that the Boxers seemed to have been well organized and had developed the tactical skills of military maneuver and ambush. When the news reached Beijing, the notion of possession of magic by the Boxers once again caught the attention of court conservatives' vivid imaginations. The pro-Boxer element took this opportunity to put forth further arguments for the necessity of diverting the Boxers' enormous energy to the defense of the country against the foreigners." End quote. So the idea here is that these Boxers are going to end up drawing in these foreign powers to the shores of China. And the biggest fear in the Qing dynasty's court is that these foreigners will then take out Cixi and implant their own dynastic emperor. Many of these court officials would immediately lose their jobs and probably be exiled if such a thing were to take place. And this could be part of the reason why the Qing court doesn't comply with Western demands at the end of May, at the end of this bloody month for these Boxers in Chile. Despite the reports that are coming out of Chile, many of the Westerners are still hesitant to put ships in China's ports again. So they end up sending a more reasonable request to the Qing, one that they can certainly carry out. A group of Western ministers in Beijing demand that the Qing court do the following. Quote, "It demanded that, quote, all persons who should print, publish, or disseminate placards which menace foreigners, all individuals aiding and abetting, all owners of houses or temples now used as meeting places for Boxers should be executed." They also demanded that, quote, "those guilty of arson, murder, outrages, and together with those affording support or direction to the Boxers while committing such outrages should be executed." End quote. So Western powers are asking for Beijing to take decisive measures against all elements of the Boxers. But as these Qing dynasty officials are reading this demand from the Western powers, they're getting in more and more reports from the Chile province. Reports that are telling them that this problem that the Boxers are presenting is getting even worse. It's getting more violent, and the Boxers are drawing more and more peasants into their ranks. So in order to fulfill the demand of these Westerners, the Qing dynasty realizes that they'll have to pull away troops from their coasts and from their ports. The thing is that these troops are guarding these ports and guarding the coast because the Qing dynasty is afraid of a Western invasion. So it wouldn't be unfair for the Qing court to think for a second and realize, well, okay, these Western powers want us to move our troops inland, away from our coasts. Maybe they're staging an invasion of their own and just setting us up. So the Qing dynasty will end up using its troops more close to home. They'll reinforce Beijing and the surrounding suburbs, and they'll also produce a pronouncement, which is the most forceful one against the Boxers thus far. The Qing dynasty handed down the following, quote, "The Beijing Metropolitan Police Quarters acted quickly. It outlined an unequivocal list of 10 regulations banning the Boxer activities. 1. Ban the Boxer associations. 2. Investigate and punish heretic religions. 3. Punish bad elements among the people. 4. Investigate and destroy placards. 5. Post banning orders. 6. Strengthen vigilance in street blocks. 7. Send soldiers on patrol. 8. Demand fathers and elder brothers to prohibit sons and siblings to practice Boxer rituals. 9. Neighborhoods will be implicated if someone in the neighborhood practices the Boxer rituals. 10. Prohibit printing houses from printing the placards that the Boxers are producing." End quote. This will actually be a larger scale effort to put down these Boxers than the Western forces were actually asking for in the first place. All of this added stuff about demanding fathers and elders to prohibit their sons and siblings from practicing Boxer rituals, those types of things were not something that the Western powers had asked for. But it seems as if the Boxers are not taking this threat by the government too seriously. On May 26, the Boxers begin ripping up Western railroads right outside of Beijing, and this will turn the heads of the Westerners a bit more forcefully, as will the Boxer response to the Qing dynasty's effort to stamp them out in Beijing. The Boxers respond with a memorandum of their own. Quote, "Meanwhile, the Boxers continued to ignore the government warnings. A widespread declaration issued by the Chile Boxers on May 28th stated the following, quote, "The Catholic and Protestant churches defame the divine gods. They bully the Chinese government from above and the Chinese people from below. The divine gods and people are all outraged. You should practice the divine Yi-He boxing ritual in order to defend China, expel the foreign bandits, and kill the converts so as to avoid major calamities." End quote. The declaration demanded that the population drive out Christian converts from every village and burn railways, churches, and all properties of the converts. Thousands upon thousands of villagers answered the call and participated in burning the railways and electricity poles. End quote. Qing imperial troops end up making their way to these sabotaged railroads and open fire on many of the Boxers, ripping them up, instantly killing dozens of them. This has the effect of pouring gasoline on this fire that is raging in the peasantry. And as these activities approach Beijing and the ferocity of them picks up, the delegates in Beijing from Western powers meet again. And this includes this Russian minister who has been passing some of this information along to the Chinese. And the conversation that takes place at this meeting between the Western powers involves much more talk of the Empress Dowager's staying power on the throne. The French have already brought more guards to defend their legations in Beijing, and this German minister who's present at this meeting, well, he'll openly talk of partitioning China and removing the Empress from the throne. This information gets sent along to the Qing dynasty by this Russian minister who's present. And by this moment in the Boxer Rebellion, Cixi has already been meeting pretty regularly with a senior military official who has informed her that she can quell the barbarians should they invade. The barbarians not being the Boxers, but the barbarians being Westerners. So as Cixi has the opportunity to ponder what exactly the situation is in Beijing, with these Western powers becoming more and more unnerved by this Boxer movement, now resting just outside of Beijing, the Western powers besides France and Germany feel the need to not be left out should China be partitioned. This is an element of the entire story we've been telling. The fact that one Western nation being perceived as actively taking part in the partitioning of China will lead all the other ones to not want to be left out of this big game. Zhang describes the situation like this, quote, "As usual, European politics prevailed in Beijing. As the French had already requested legation guards, the other ministers had to follow suit. The burning of the Fangtai station by the Boxers on May 29th finally interrupted the traffic between Tianjin and Beijing. It provided the ministers with a timely excuse for justifying their decision of calling up the legation guards. Under the circumstances, the British and Russian ministers grudgingly agreed to this action for fear of being left out. Nobody wanted to be left out of the new power game as a result of the foreign military presence in the capital of the Chinese Empire." End quote. So here we have the Germans and the French upping the ante for all of the other Western powers. Once the British see this happen, they'll make sure to send just as many guards as everyone else. The Italians will follow suit with the same logic. But calling in these Western forces to protect delegates living in Beijing against these Boxers who are now in the suburbs will unsettle the Qing court. For obvious reasons. They don't want foreigners on their soil at all, but they're willing to make some concessions. However, a joint military buildup, which is what this thing looks like to the Chinese, they see all of these powers bringing in equal amounts of their own forces. And this is really because none of these powers want to be left out of the partitioning of China should it occur. So this Qing dynasty is not in the wrong frame of mind here. They are, let's say, justifiably paranoid. However you'd like to describe their attitude, once these Western troops make their way to Beijing, the conservative elements of the Qing court will begin writing recommendations to Cixi about how to handle this new situation. The following is a memorandum written by the governor of Beijing in 1900 and another one of these conservative Qing court officials. They write, quote, "Since the Boxers are widespread, it is impossible to kill them all. It would be better to recruit them into the regular army, to turn their hatred for the Christian church into brave spirit. The Boxers are under the pretext of exterminating the foreigners, and the foreigners consider them deadly enemies. Therefore, if we recruit them, the foreigners will raise questions. But every country has its own way to raise troops for self-defense. Other countries have no right to intervene in our domestic affairs. Thus, this method is valid as long as we can control their behavior." End quote. Zhang will then go on to explain more of the reasoning behind why this memorandum is so important. Quote, "While the idea contained in this memorandum was not exactly original, it was presented by officials of the top elite circle. The significance of this memorandum lay in the fact that the court's anti-foreign conservatives, who had thus far been restrained by the Empress Dowager, had decided to risk everything to rally official support for the Boxers. The timing could not have been better in view of the movement of foreign legation guards against the court's will." End quote. So these incoming Western troops who are going to Beijing in order to defend these delegations against these Boxers end up being the impetus for the Dowager opening up the consideration to align with the Boxers once again. And it seems as if these Western powers didn't really take into consideration this idea that Cixi would be prompted to move her position once Western guards were on Chinese soil. Around this same time, communication between Western diplomats in Beijing and the Imperial Palace break off. And in this period of silence, the two parties begin moving into their own corners. Cixi moving further to the position of incorporating these Boxers as foot soldiers into her military, and Westerners further entrenching themselves in the position that they have to guard against these Boxers infiltrating Beijing. And the Westerners have watched the Imperial Palace issue decrees which have downplayed the importance of the Boxers and which were meant to diminish their role in Beijing specifically. And this was done because of the encouragement of the Western powers. But one of the other things these Westerners are now taking into consideration is the idea that this whole Qing dynasty might fall under this wave of Boxers making its way towards the capital. And if that were to happen, well, China could descend into a state of anarchy. And a state of anarchy would defeat the whole purpose, the whole reason why these Western powers are in China in the first place. To maintain the flow of goods and commerce, to maintain the cash flow which they've enjoyed coming out of China and into their coffers. So in the silence between Cixi and these Western diplomats, she keeps making pronunciations which seem very anti-Boxer. She orders Beijing police to keep arresting anyone who seems like a Boxer, but at the same time, internally, the palace is leaning heavily pro-Boxer. These Qing dynasty officials end up convincing the Empress Cixi that these foreign warships and these Western guards who have come to defend their citizens in Beijing from these Boxers are more dangerous than the Boxers themselves. In early June of 1900, she ends up coming to the aid of the Boxers and aligning with them against the Westerners. She'll have the city's gates opened up for a large mass of Boxers waiting outside, who are invited in to continue their operations in the city. She'll sack the city's police chief, who until recently had been ordered to suppress the Boxers, and will install as a police chief one of the brothers of one of these very conservative Manchu court elites. Zhang describes the situation on the ground in Beijing when all of this begins to occur. He writes, quote, "With the simultaneous presence of the Chinese regular army, the foreign marines, and the unruly Boxers, the normally quiet life in Beijing was greatly disturbed. Everyone was expecting something ominous to happen, though no one knew what it might be. The streets were tense, and the residents were nervous. Anyone uttering a sensational cry could cause major chaos in the city. Eyewitness reports recorded various incidents when someone simply yelled, 'Coming!' in the streets. Shopkeepers thought that the bandits or foreign troops were arriving, and at once closed their businesses. One afternoon, a mischievous teenager suddenly shouted, 'Spill water!' Everyone living in nearby blocks, without knowing why, began to pour water out onto the streets. The Boxers publicly asserted that kerosene was evil because its Chinese popular name, Yang Yu, meant foreign oil. The residents of the city began dumping gallons of kerosene into the streets, making Beijing smell like an oil tank. The Boxers admonished the residents to perform Boxer rituals at home to avoid calamities to their families. Many residents dutifully followed their instructions, offering prayers towards the southeast every morning. The psychological tension rose even higher when the Boxers started to make open threats to burn down all foreign facilities and houses." End quote. Zhang points out that around this same time, a huge influx of illegal knives and spears can be noticed into Beijing from the surrounding counties. Zhang points out that blacksmiths are allowed to work 24 hours a day in order to produce the large demand of weapons that the Boxers are asking for. And some high-ranking officials in Beijing begin to notice this and begin to fear what a popular uprising in Beijing, not just among the Boxers, but amongst the general population in Beijing, might look like from the foreigners' stance. This would surely bring in a large cohort of Western troops, something that the Qing dynasty would still like to avoid. But when these appeals are made to these conservative Manchu elites next to Empress Dowager, they're denied, and this large-scale black market weapons manufacturing continues. And as Beijing is heating up, so is Tianjin, the nearby city where in 1870 we saw the Tianjin massacre. This is an event we covered in the beginning of today's program. French priests and nuns were slaughtered by the local Chinese population, and this is one of the very first acts where we see missionaries suffer in this way at the hands of a strong anti-foreign sentiment. So it's somewhat fitting that the first place we see Boxers fight against foreign troops is right outside of Tianjin. And it's here that the Boxers beat back Russian troops attempting to save a number of beleaguered Westerners. And this is not a good look for European troops on the ground in China, as the British diplomat, who has been quite worried about his legation in Beijing becoming under siege by these Boxers, he commented on this initial victory for the Boxers against European troops. He said, quote, "The fact that the European soldiers had to retreat before the Boxers will have a very bad effect, and encourage the general belief in the supernatural powers possessed by the latter." End quote. And there's another aspect of this story that this British diplomat is not explicitly pointing to, and this is the idea that the Russians, of all of these interested parties, are the first to make contact with these Boxer rebels. Now, what could be the problem for the Brits regarding this situation? Well, the problem here is that the Russians have already moved into Manchuria in the last couple decades. They've taken huge amounts of territory, which is great for their mining businesses, but also great for laying down railroads, which could help them transport goods without the help of British ships, without giving money into this large British empire, which, if the Russians are going to keep expanding, they need to check. Even prior to this event, a British military attaché has informed his nation that they should, if the Russians are to send in troops, follow suit for this very reason. It can't be the case that the Russians end up taking large swaths of territory before anyone has a chance to send in their own troops. At this point, we also have to start thinking of Japan, which has its own, very soon to be violent, expansionist instincts, which we saw earlier in the Sino-Japanese War over Korea. But now they're looking to do the same as the Brits. They're looking to check Russian expansion. So they want to send in their own troops too and be a part of what the Chinese come to refer as the slicing of the melon. This phrase refers to the partitioning of China by Western powers, an idea that's already been brought up by the Germans So now we have to turn to the Germans. The Russians making this move against the Boxers precipitates the military invasion of numerous Western powers. But before any of these foreign powers are going to follow Russia's footsteps and go to war with the Boxers, they first want to meet with the Empress Dowager. They want to inform her that, look, this situation is serious. If you don't do something about these Boxers immediately, you're going to have 6, 7, 8 Western nations' militaries on your soil. And how's that going to look for your imperial dynasty? Now, they might not lay out these terms in such a way. The Empress Dowager had never been keen on talking serious issues with any Westerners. So predictably, when this meeting is requested by the British, it's declined. A few days later, Chinese Boxers attack British students and start burning down Western houses. This is enough for the British to get involved. The British begin to call for unilateral action on the ground in China against the Boxer rebels, being led by the English, the Russians, the French, Japanese, and the Americans. But there's a problem here. The Brits have already gotten an agreement from the Japanese that the Japanese will help them land some of their soldiers on Chinese soil. The Brits don't necessarily have the manpower they need in Asia. The Japanese do. But we have to remember that the French and the Russians are allies at this moment in history. The French, when they hear of this potential unilateral action, they propose that the field commander of this army be a Russian. Now, this spikes up the interest of the Brits, who counter and say, okay, well, this guy can be the on-the-ground commander, but supervising this whole mission is going to be a Brit. Everyone stalemates at this point. No one is willing to let the other side of this Britain-Tokyo alliance and this French-Russian alliance take the upper hand with this field army. At this point, the Americans step in on these negotiations. Up until now, they've been very hesitant to get involved in any military action that doesn't involve directly protecting their own citizens in China. But now, with this Boxer uprising making its way into Beijing and threatening the whole structure of China, let alone these delegations, they up the ante. While hearing all of these negotiations that are perpetually failing between the French and Russian side and between the Japanese and the British side, American Captain McCulloch basically says, look, I'm going to march tomorrow, whether you're with me or not. This ends up prompting these other powers to agree to allow a Japanese commander to take care of all the logistics. Now, quite clearly, this is something that the Russians don't want. They're fearing Tokyo now more than ever. The Japanese have looked stronger on the world stage than ever before. Their industrial complex is growing at a pace faster than most of the Westerners, if you consider where the Japanese had started in the mid-19th century. So the Russians are quite worried about this idea, but as Lan Jinjiang explains, this is how they sort of rationalized the need to get involved in this way. Quote, Russia, of course, resented the fact that her principal rival in the Far East had assumed command of the Allied forces, but the Russian government had no choice but to participate in the hasty Allied operation because, as Admiral Alexiev had argued, there was a need for a Russian presence to counterbalance the other foreign troops before the arrival of larger Russian reinforcements from Port Arthur. Zhang then briefly describes that the Russians and the French had both agreed that military action would be needed if things escalated. Zhang continues, quote, in early June, anti-Russian riots erupted in Manchuria and northern China. Russian churches were burnt to the ground in Manchuria, while Russian tea merchants in northern China reported that their lives were in grave danger. The Russian minister sent a telegram on June 9th to St. Petersburg stating that, quote, in my opinion, the role of the ministers has come to an end, and the admirals must take charge of the situation. Only the prompt arrival of a strong force can save the foreigners from Peking, end quote. Around this time, the Chinese set up their own government for war. This involves promoting many of these anti-foreign conservatives to posts that are somewhat out of their league. Quite predictably, none of these conservatives have almost any experience with working with foreigners. And now they're all placed in positions where if this war were to end badly for them, they'd have to negotiate with foreigners. Cixi is digging her heels in even more. So as this Seymour expedition, this is a British-led expedition with this Japanese commander providing for all the logistics, As this expedition begins to move towards Beijing, Cixi's in a precarious situation. Zhang describes it as, quote, "The Empress Dowager now felt caught in a terrible position. She was facing pressure on two sides. On the one hand, the Boxer movement had reached a point where control of the metropolitan area was threatened. On the other hand, the substantial number of foreign troops were posing a direct threat to the capital itself. The Empress's top priority was to stop the foreign troops. Hence, she lost no time in organizing the war effort, though the ultimate objective was not entirely clear at this time. She continued to hesitate over open war with the powers. No resolute order was issued to the Imperial troops to engage the Seymour expedition. Her ambiguity was fully reflected by the fact that the court began to issue a string of conflicting decrees. With one breath, it ordered the troops to regroup in Beijing to suppress the rebels. With another, it urged the general to defend Tianjin and Dagu to repel any foreign advance." End quote. And these conflicting decrees will basically leave some of these military officers in the field for the Qing dynasty at a loss. One of them complains openly to his superiors that, "Well, I don't know what to do with these foreign troops. We have the Boxers that we're supposed to be fighting, we have these foreign troops who we might supposed to be fighting, but you're telling me not to fight either one of them." So, on the ground, there's a lot of problems for the Qing dynasty early on in this Seymour expedition, this expedition led by the British and the Japanese. However, much of this confusion will be cleared up on June 11th when a group of Chinese soldiers kill the chancellor of the Japanese legation in Beijing. What happens is this Italian minister, who is somewhat, as Lan Jinjiang describes, somewhat depressed over his lack of involvement in this whole Boxer affair. Yes, he's on the ground and he's involved in negotiations and his troops will be sent in, but he's not taking the lead. So what he does is he heads out to meet this Seymour expedition before it reaches Beijing. This is an act of bravery, no doubt. In Beijing right now, the anti-foreign hatred is skyrocketing. Like we said, knife factories are selling out, specifically due to this Boxer incursion into the city. So making his way out of the city for this Italian minister is no easy task, and he does this. And as he meets the soldiers, he passes by a group of disgruntled Chinese soldiers who are there to meet the Seymour expedition. And when the Italian does go out to try and meet this Seymour expedition, well, this angers the Chinese soldiers quite a bit. Anti-foreign hatred, like I said, has spread from the Boxers throughout the countryside, now into the cities and into the Imperial Army. Now, this Japanese chancellor, Akira Sugiyama, will end up doing the same. He'll end up reaching out to the Seymour expedition by leaving the city and trying to meet some of the Japanese commanders. And when he's unable to do so and begins to head home back to Beijing, some Chinese soldiers let their anger get the best of them and descend upon Sugiyama and kill him with their swords. Now, the reaction to this Sugiyama affair is interesting. The Japanese don't take it immediately as a declaration of war. They continue to maintain that without the British, the Japanese won't go and fight the Chinese alone. But this does end up precipitating a number of moves by Rong Lu, that man who we said was at the helm of the Chinese military in the beginning of the spring of 1900, who had seen a fortune teller who had told him that, "Oh, this year's going to be great." And then Rong Lu takes leave of absence, in which all of these conservative Manchu elites begin to convince the Empress Dowager that these Boxers might be a useful ally. Well, at this point, Rong has returned from his leave of absence, the latter half of which had been spent sending desperate letters to the Empress Cixi to get her to take a different stance against these Westerners. And now that he's back, he thinks that he needs a man who can take control of this situation in Chile, who has been very talented dealing with Westerners, a man who's been demoted, and a man who's been left out of most of Part 2 of this Century of Humiliation, Li Hongzhang. Li Hongzhang, after the Sino-Japanese War, had been humiliated, probably wrongly so. It was not entirely his fault, the conclusion of the Sino-Japanese War, but he comes back on the scene and is installed in Chile, a move by Rong that indicates that he, at least, is understanding the future consequences of more actions like this Sugiyama affair. And it's also good timing for this appointment because this Seymour expedition, led by British Admiral Seymour, has made its way from Tianjin to Beijing. Or at least they're trying to make their way. We have to remember that the railway that Seymour is taking is the same one that these boxers have just spent months tearing up and burning. So this travel, though it's only 70 miles, is taking much longer than they originally thought, which has the obvious effect of worrying many of these delegates who are living in Beijing, who notice all of these boxers still flooding into the city and making noises about burning down Western houses and killing Westerners themselves. So, as Seymour is making his way from Tianjin to Beijing, his rail cars have to stop numerous times for his engineers to make repairs and to put back the dismantled railways. And as they do, they notice basically hordes of boxers, surrounding them, not attacking, but lurking. And as a group of these boxers come closer, the first encounter takes place. They come with swords and spears and red turbans on, and they're slaughtered by British machine guns. After Seymour's troops cut down these group of boxers, they get back on the road. As they make their way to the next station, another event that almost mirrors the last occurs. Hordes of boxers begin throwing themselves towards the machine guns of the British and other international soldiers. Seymour's expedition then makes its way to the next station, where another group of boxers has been plotting to halt this Seymour expedition to Beijing. And while they'll lose countless young men in doing so, they'll end up succeeding. One of Seymour's lieutenants, Lieutenant Fownes Luttrell, describes the grisly scenes and the encounters with the boxers. He writes, quote, "It was only by very smart work that Captain Jellicoe succeeded in getting a Maxim gun in place ahead of the train before the boxers were able to charge. Then all was well. The boxers displayed great bravery, but it was a case of fighting with antiquated arms against modern scientific weapons. Slowly they came on, shouting, with their swords and pikes flashing in the sun, merely to be mown down, whole ranks at a time by rifle and machine gun fire. This fanatical contempt was due to the fact that they had been taught by their leaders that death and wounds would only ensue as punishment for want of courage and enthusiasm for the national cause. Moreover, the leaders themselves afforded a fine example of their teaching by dancing and singing in front of their men during the attack." End quote. And I just hinted at the overall success of this Boxer expedition against the Seymour expedition. So when they attack Seymour's troops, there's very little success in actually killing anyone on the other side, and many Boxers lose their lives. However, all of this interruption gives the Boxers more time to rip up railroads, both ahead of this Seymour train cohort and behind it, leaving the Seymour expedition stranded between China and Tianjin. However, Seymour isn't quite ready to abandon his trains just yet. He hasn't experienced an attack by the Qing Imperial forces just yet, and he's mostly just had to deal with boxers. So any delay leaves them open to men with swords and pikes, not necessarily a formidable military force. But that will soon change. Cixi informs one of her leading generals, who is particularly anti-Western and anti-foreign, a man who's already said he wants to take on these foreign barbarian troops, that if they were to enter Beijing, he would be held responsible. This general proceeds to bring many of his troops to guard the Tianjin railways, these railways that the boxers have been ripping up, and he combines his forces with a few thousand boxers. These combined forces meet the Seymour expedition at Langfang and send them back to Tianjin, halting their forward march to Beijing to relieve the besieged delegations. While the foreign troops will only lose about 10 men, and the boxers, combined with the Imperial troops, will lose nearly 400, the situation is unnerving for these Western troops on the ground. They feel surrounded in a foreign country, and they don't want any part of this forward march to Beijing, which would include countless other encounters just like this. Lan Jinjiang describes both the attitude of the Chinese witnessing this and the foreigners. He writes, quote, "The crestfallen expeditionary troops were agonizing over the unexpected humiliation suffered at the hands of the Chinese. They knew that the Chinese would undoubtedly be encouraged by their first success in driving the foreign soldiers out of the vicinity of Beijing. The belief in the Boxers' magic power would greatly be reinforced. In fact, many Chinese coolies had deserted the Seymour expedition because they believed that the Boxers were truly invincible after having seen them in action. Some coolies had even advanced the theory that those dead Boxers would rise again to perform their combat duty. The Allied soldiers, therefore, decided to deliberately leave piles of bodies unburied to show that the dead could never be revived. End quote. So as this Seymour expedition veers towards failure, we should recount why it had to happen in the first place. Why this expedition needed to be launched from Tianjin, 70 miles away from Beijing, to try and relieve these beleaguered Westerners living in Beijing. Well, it's because these Westerners, over the course of the last few weeks, has been noticing a huge influx of Boxers, knife-wielding Boxers, who are calling for, their fellow Chinese citizens to start burning down the houses of Westerners. But there's very little open violence early on in this first swelling of Boxers into Beijing. And, if you're a Westerner on the ground, how could you help but be terrified? But one thing that could relieve this terror that a lot of these Westerners are feeling are some legation guards. These Western powers have been sending in some guards to protect these delegations. Most of these men have rifles. As we saw in Seymour's encounters with the Boxers, their modern arms far outpaced, what the Boxers are able to bring to battle. So the legation guards are helping some of these Westerners calm down. But the Seymour expedition taking off, a body of international troops making their way towards Beijing to, finally put an end to these Boxers and protect the delegations, well, it sort of imbibes a false confidence into some of these Western troops in Beijing. Upon hearing of the Seymour expedition's short arrival, because these legation guards are not getting any information about what's happening with this Seymour expedition. As far as they know, it was launched from Tianjin, and in a few days it should be arriving. It's only 70 miles away. But what they couldn't know is how much damage these Boxers had done to the railways. So these legation guards, who have been watching these Boxers in Beijing menace many Westerners, and they've seen knife production go up, well, you can sort of describe them as in a corner, being cornered by all of these Boxers in Beijing. And this Seymour expedition is, as if they looked over these Boxers' shoulders and saw an army of Western troops making their way to come relieve them. But they act a bit prematurely. Before they ever see Seymour's expedition, they begin killing Boxers in the streets of Beijing. 3 days after the Westerners are informed that the Seymour expedition has launched from Tianjin, on Friday the 13th, 1900, German diplomat Clemens von Kettler is walking through the streets of Beijing, accompanied by some of his German legation guards. He encounters 3 young Boxers, one of which is sharpening his knife. He walks over to the boy sharpening his knife and begins beating him with his walking stick. Immediately, the other 2 flee, and his German guards seize the boy and bring him basically into captivity. They tie him to a tree and beat him some more. The Germans inform the Chinese that the boy will soon die if the Qing dynasty doesn't do something about these Boxers in Beijing. The Boxers have the reaction that you might expect. They take to the streets and begin burning down a Christian church. More Western guards meet their knives and spears with machine guns, and the battle looks similar to the ones fought by the Seymour expedition on their way to Beijing. Lan Jinjiang gives a similar description for how the streets of Beijing on Friday the 13th of June 1900 look, and it's similar to how the Seymour expedition and some of their firefights against the Boxers looked. He writes, quote, "By the evening, hundreds of the Boxers and Beijing residents gathered at the Hademan near the legation quarters. The first chapel of the Christian missionaries on Hademan Street was set on fire. The great chaos in downtown Beijing had begun. The killing of Boxers was out of control by the evening. The Italian guards opened heavy, unprovoked fire at a group of Chinese loitering in the vicinity of the legations. Austrians and French guards patrolled the legation street at night and shot at whatever human silhouette they could see with no scruples. The Chinese crowd grew bigger and bigger. At one point, Austrian soldiers simply positioned their machine guns in the center of the road and opened hundreds of rounds at a presumed Boxer crowd. However, to their great astonishment, no dead body was left at the scene after the crowd dispersed. It turned out that the Austrians had aimed too high. But a rumor began to spread among the Chinese that the Boxers had succeeded in using their magic power to repel the bullets. More crowds were gathering on the streets. Some were curious onlookers, but many were angry citizens. End quote. The initial victims of the Boxer response are Chinese Christians. While these Westerners can hole up in their legation quarters and are guarded by Western troops, many Chinese Christians are left out to dry. They're stabbed in the streets, their houses are burnt down, they're dismembered, mutilated. The treatment of Chinese Christians in Beijing is appalling, as was the action of these Austrian troops who opened fire that set off these atrocities. Other legation guards begin participating in what Jiang calls the hunting down of Boxers. One account describes German soldiers scaling the wall that divides the Chinese city from these legation quarters and picking off Boxers on the street. In the early stages of this battle in Beijing, there are no deaths reported on the Western side. And it is at the apex of this lawlessness and indiscriminate killing that the French minister receives a letter informing him that the Seymour expedition will not be arriving anytime soon. One can only imagine the shock and fear that must have been sent through these legation quarters, right? If they were backed into a corner, using this metaphor that we had earlier, if they're backed into a corner by these Boxers and they're looking over the shoulder, seeing the Seymour expedition come their way, well, now they've just watched them turn around, and they're gonna have to fight for themselves and fight in the context that they've helped create, in this context of indiscriminate killing and butchery. And it's soon after this all begins that a popular collective uprising ensues and proceeds to surround the legation quarters. The residents of Beijing, in conjunction with these Boxers, are now sieging the legations, and Westerners are inside without any help from this Seymour expedition or any incoming troops. In response, the Qing dynasty gets a little less ambiguous about their position on the Boxers. They say that anybody supporting this killing and anyone wielding a knife is liable to be killed. Anyone who is near these legations after hours can also be killed. They ban the Boxers with a formal decree, but it has little effect. The Boxers continue their rampage, and a few days after this siege of the legations begins, they set fire to the only Western pharmacy in Beijing. And the fire spreads and engulfs 1,000 other buildings and houses. The destruction in Beijing is quickly getting out of hand, and a total state of lawlessness is a proper description for what's taking place in June of 1900 in Beijing. Luella Minor was an American professor working in Beijing during the time of this Boxer Rebellion, and her diary provides some descriptions of what it was like on the ground being besieged by these Boxer rebels. She wrote, quote, "At about 10 o'clock, the most horrible noise began in the southern city, just on the opposite side of the city wall. It was a horde of Boxers going through their rites, burning incense, crying, 'Kill the foreign devils, kill the secondary foreign devils, kill, kill, kill.' They called other things, but I could only distinguish the kill. There may have been from 20 to 50,000 voices, not all Boxers, swelling that mad tumult. After 2 or 3 hours, the noise suddenly ceased. The Boxers, in their indiscriminate pillaging, had looted a Mohammedan bank. The Mohammedans gathered a band of 300, pursued them, and got back their money, after which the mob dispersed." She then goes on to discuss how the legation is protecting itself from this outside chaos. She continues, quote, "Our lines of defense have been extended to include all the streets bordering on this mission property, 3 or 4 streets and alleys being under martial law, and all passers-by are challenged. The same conditions prevail on Legation Street. Stray Boxers are captured and passers-by are challenged. The missionaries and Chinese who have weapons all help in guard duty. There are barbed wire barricades at the end of each street. Now in the compound and adjoining streets, we have barricade within barricade of barbed wire or brick. All the walls and some of the small buildings have been torn up to get this brick. This is said to be the best fortified place in the city now. thanks to the free labor of our numerous refugees. And if we had a Gatling or a machine gun, we would feel quite safe." End quote. Another thing we have to add on to this rising tension described by Luella Minor is the fact that communication wires, telegraph wires, have been cut as soon as this Boxer siege begins. So all of these Americans are now without a word, and they're waiting for the Seymour expedition, which they've been told should arrive any day now, even though it's stalled, not even halfway to Beijing. Robert Coltman was another American who was besieged in Beijing in the summer of 1900. He was working in China as a physician, and he was also a freelance journalist and a writer by trade, and he took careful diaries of his experience during that summer. And after the siege was over, he published this diary as a book. He entitled it Beleaguered in Peking. After describing some of the places that the Boxers are focusing their efforts on, pharmacies, Western-style houses, the houses of Chinese Christians, Coltman tells of the fighting that he witnesses on the street. He writes, quote, "At each place the furious Boxers, aided by their soldier sympathizers, have murdered, with shocking mutilation, all of the gatekeepers, as well as any children and women in the neighborhood suspected of being Christians or foreign sympathizers. At the South Cathedral, the massacre was shocking. So much so that when some of the poor mutilated children came feeling across the city, bringing the news of what was going on, a relief party was organized from our little force, consisting of 12 Russians, 12 American Marines, and 2 civilians, armed with shotguns, who, risking conflict with Manchu troops, marched 2 miles from our barricades, and, coming on the Boxers, suddenly in the midst of the ruins, fired a number of volleys into them, killing over 60, upon which the rest fled. They then collected the women and children hidden in the surrounding alleys and marched them back to us, where they are, for the present, safe." End quote. Coltman mentions sympathizing troops, which is odd, or at least should be odd, given the fact that Cixi has just sent down, proclamations stating that if you seem to be a Boxer and you're carrying a knife, well, you're up for execution. So why aren't these Imperial troops doing anything about this? Coltman describes an encounter with an Imperial troop who's watching all this grisly behavior and all of this death and the massacre of Chinese Christians and Chinese citizens and doing nothing. Coltman writes, quote, "Manchu soldiers have stood idly by in thousands and have seen the frightful butcheries of converts and suspected converts without raising a finger to interfere. When questioned why they did not obey the edicts authorizing them to suppress arson and looting, they have replied, quote, 'We have other instructions,' end quote." So as the Seymour expedition is failing, and as this unrelenting mayhem is ensuing in Beijing, the Western powers think it's about time to do something about this Boxer Rebellion, and it's about time to take on the Qing dynasty. But they don't have any offense to really respond to at this point. The Boxers aren't enough for them to legally feel comfortable waging war against the Chinese. So they have to come up with a diplomatic trick that will allow them to justify firing shots at the Qing dynasty. What they end up coming up with is sending an ultimatum to a general who's in charge of the Dagu forts, which are a series of forts on the coast of China which protect a river that leads into mainland China. It's an important river for commerce and transportation, and it's how these Western powers are going to get all of their military supplies and troops towards Beijing and Tianjin. So on June 16th, these Western powers begin formulating this ultimatum, which is going to basically say that the Chinese have to hand over these Dagu forts to the Westerners, something that is very unlikely to occur. And like I said, they give this ultimatum to the general, not to the relevant civilian authority. He can't make this decision on his own whether or not to accept this ultimatum. So he informs them. He says, look, I'm going to have to send this up the ladder, and it's going to take a lot longer. They're only giving this guy 5 hours to respond. This ultimatum gets to his door at 9 o'clock at night. They're demanding that the forts be handed over by 2 in the morning the next day. But that 2 o'clock deadline won't become very relevant. An hour before it, at about 1 o'clock in the morning, as these Western ships are gathering outside of these Dagu forts, and as the Chinese are scrambling to their posts to get ready, one of them accidentally fires a shot. And I should mention that there are some debates over which side this shot initially came from, but it seems most likely that it came from the Chinese side. War has just broken out between the Western powers and China. The Western powers end up seizing these forts, but not without insignificant losses. The Chinese will do a good job considering that they've had barely any time to get to their posts and to man these forts. But the forts are taken, and the Western powers now begin their military invasion and their battles against the imperial dynasty. It takes some time for news of this event to reach the imperial palace. We have to remember that the Boxers have cut almost all of the telegraph lines around Beijing and Tianjin. But once this information does reach the court, well, there's widespread, let's say, emotional chaos. We have reports of officials crying and openly shouting about war, but Cixi is not quite ready to pull the trigger yet. She's been informed that Western ships are outside the Dagu forts, but hasn't been told that they've been taken just yet. But to push her along towards declaring war, an anti-foreign Manchu court official gives her a note that he says is from a Western diplomat. And this note will have a lot to do with Cixi's future decision to declare war on the Western powers. The note read as follows, quote, "The note had made 4 explicit demands. 1. Specify an official residence for the emperor. 2. Provincial revenues and grain to be collected by foreign authorities on behalf of the Chinese government. 3. The Chinese military authority to be transferred to the foreign powers. 4. Compel the Empress Dowager to return power to the emperor." End quote. Turning over power of the military to Western powers? Not going to happen. Convincing this anti-foreign court that Cixi has assembled to dethrone her and put the Emperor Guangxu back on the throne? Also not going to happen. This is enough for Cixi and her anti-foreign Manchu court officials to go to war with. But what's interesting about this note is that there's no evidence it actually came from a Western diplomat. From the sources, it seems likely that this note was a forgery done by a pro-war, pro-boxer, anti-Western, anti-foreign court official. Other scholars suggest that this note could have been added after the war was over into the archives as a way of sort of justifying Cixi's actions. But what seems to be true is that no foreign diplomat on the ground in China had a hand in sending this note to Cixi. Wherever this note came from, it justified war for Cixi. Lan Jinjiang describes her position after receiving the note and after the Dagu forts had been taken. He writes, quote, "To the Empress Dowager, both the Seymour expedition and the threat of taking the Dagu forts pointed in one direction, the overthrow of her government. At this point, she was fully convinced that her suspicions that the foreign powers were plotting against her personally was correct. This was, for her, a casus belli. The Empress Dowager was not a person who could sit idly by, waiting for the fate of her regime to be dictated by others. She was a person of action when crucial issues were involved. The note came at the right moment, and she decided to raise the hitherto forbidden subject. By declaring the note an official diplomatic communication, she was able to justify the decision to go to war." End quote. The Chinese will send 2 military units up near Tianjin, one to meet this force of Westerners who have just taken the Dagu forts and who are making their way to the Western concessions in Tianjin to help protect them from Boxers. And just for clarity, we should note that Cixi is not aware of what has actually occurred at these Dagu forts quite yet. She still doesn't know how the battle's gone. In addition to this regiment, she'll send another, which will actively shell and fire at and besiege these concessions before any help can get there. These concessions are guarded by about 2,500 foreign soldiers, most of them Russians. Initially, the unit that's sent to meet these foreigners coming in from the Dagu forts does well in halting their forward march. They take on some losses, but they also stop the Westerners from getting to these concessions, which the other unit has just begun besieging. The concessions begin to get hit with artillery fire, which indicates to them that these are no Boxers. This is the Imperial military. However, the Imperial military is being aided by Boxers, who, as we've seen, are being used as basically cannon fodder in some moments. After being holed up for a few days, The Seymour expedition comes back home to Tianjin, the place they'd launched from, right? Remember the Seymour expedition? That's the expedition that left from Tianjin a couple weeks ago to go and try and help these besieged, boxer-ridden legations in Beijing. So Admiral Seymour, who had just led this failure of a campaign, is now in charge of protecting these legations in Tianjin. And after he takes over, the siege is soon broken, and the foreign troops leave the concession and take after their Chinese foes. So at this point, the Westerners in Tianjin have just cleared the way to Beijing to go help these beleaguered Westerners and diplomats living in these legations who are surrounded by these boxers. At this point, the imperial court and its conservative elites begin to hunker down and prepare for war in Beijing. They begin discussing whether or not to expel all Westerners living there out of the city. Some even begin to suggest that they should just openly kill many of these diplomats and send a message. Li Hongzhang, the man who was charged with the task of putting down the Chile boxers, is now back in Guangdong, and he's getting letters from colleagues still inside the government informing him of the direction that these plans are going in, and predictably, he's quite worried. He's someone who's dealt with the Westerners more closely than almost anyone else living in China that is Chinese. He understands their naval capabilities and that relying on these boxers is not going to yield the result that the imperial dynasty wants it to. However blind they make themselves to the reality that these boxers are no match for Maxim guns. Ronglu steps up again to have Li Hongzhang installed as China's chief negotiator with the Western powers as war looms around the corner. Ronglu's the same man who had suggested that Li be the man that goes up to Chile to quell this boxer rebellion up there. And once again, he steps up and asks Cixi to install him in this position. And Li does not disappoint. Even at his advanced age in 1900, there are reports saying that he has to be carried out of bed in the morning, and he is in his last days. He'll die soon after this event. But he does not disappoint. He acts very quickly with a prudent move that calls attention back to these Dagu forts. He puts up the idea that, well, there's no way of proving that these imperial troops who fired that first shot at the Dagu forts, most likely, there's no way of proving that this was ordered. The Westerners know themselves that this ultimatum was issued without enough time for the Chinese to truly respond. So if they openly acknowledge, that is the Chinese, that we didn't order for these shots to be fired, you merely showed up and this rebel contingent of troops decided to act on their own accord. This is the move that he'll make, and it's pretty convincing initially. The British, Russians, French, and the US all agree that there is no way to determine who ordered these shots to be fired. So they back off, for a bit, this idea of a multinational full-scale invasion into Beijing. It buys the Chinese some time, which they'll use to gather more and more boxers and incorporate them into the imperial army. The Chinese also pick up on their discussions about expelling foreigners from Beijing, which they end up deciding is the right move. They end up informing these Westerners that they need to leave at about 5 o'clock on the afternoon of June 19th, just a little more than a week after the Seymour expedition had taken off from Tianjin. As this buildup for a war against the foreigners is taking place, we have more pro-Western anti-boxer officials like Ronglu, Yuan Shikai, Li Hongzhang. We have their correspondence, some of which points to the insanity of the idea that the Chinese can take on all of these Western powers at once, when, one, they couldn't even take down the boxers. One of them points out that we couldn't beat the Japanese either. How are we going to beat the Japanese when they have the Germans, the French, the English, and Americans, and some Italians as well? How's this going to go for China? They know that a regime change is something that the Empress Dowager will use all of her forces to stop from happening. It's almost a suicide mission for the Chinese administration, a last-ditch effort to hold on to something that has been decaying, ever since this Taiping Rebellion, at least. And, if you think that these Chinese officials are nervous about these foreigners coming into town, these Chinese officials being the ones who know the foreigners best and know their capabilities best, Well, we have to think about these sieged people in the legation. These Westerners who are living in Beijing amongst these Boxers behind barricaded walls. They've been killing Boxers for about a week now, using their rifles against their swords in response to their burning down churches. And the responses, pretty predictably, have been maybe a bit too ambitious. They've been slaughtering Boxers in the streets, and now they're informed that they'll have to walk through those same streets out of town. And the Chinese are going to be the ones that are going to escort them out. Now, I don't know about you, but this would make me a bit uneasy. If I know that I'm living in a city that hates me, and that tomorrow I am going to have to walk through this city, well, I'm going to be a little nervous as well. These Western powers begin discussing the idea of having the Seymour expedition be their escorts instead of some Chinese Imperial Guard, which, they don't feel comfortable with. We have to remember that they don't know what happened to the Seymour expedition. It left a couple weeks ago, or just over a week ago, and it was supposed to be here in 2 or 3 days, but telegram wires have been cut by the Boxers. The Seymour expedition has been incommunicado. They think that maybe they had something to do with this incident at the Dagu forts, which they know has taken place, but they don't know the final result of. But even while this is the opinion of some of these Westerners besieged, some of them are realizing that, this wouldn't be happening if the Seymour expedition is having any success. So the idea of asking for the Seymour expedition quickly gets shot down. Another concern that some of the diplomats, at least, are taking into account is what about the Christian Chinese converts that they're going to leave behind? We have to remember that for the last couple weeks, they've been hunting Boxers. These diplomats have been using some military forces they have to go out and stop the burning of churches and stop the brutality being committed against many of these Chinese Christians. If they all leave the city, we know exactly what the Boxers will do to them. There's been evidence of this already. But these foreign ministers and diplomats only have a day. They only have until the next day at 4 o'clock to make their decision. Do we abide by this ultimatum to leave the city, or do we hunker down and face the imperial forces, who, in all likelihood, will join up with the Boxers should we defy the imperial government? They end up simply deciding to ask for more time, ask for an extension to gather their things to leave. The night before these Western diplomats and ministers are supposed to leave the city of Beijing, they all send notes to Chinese government officials telling them of their desire to have more time to gather their things so they can leave. They also request a meeting the next morning to discuss, the technicalities of how they'll go about leaving Beijing. They ask for this meeting to occur the next morning at 9 o'clock. But when 9 o'clock rolls around, there's been no response from the Chinese. The Westerners are quite sure that their position and their wiggle room is narrowing. When these ministers and foreigners wake up and realize that their request to extend their departure time hasn't even been answered, they begin to worry about this idea of them leaving the city and being led into a death trap. But as Lan Jinjiang argues, this is not really a coherent way to be thinking about the situation, probably for reasons that a lot of these Westerners don't actually understand at this moment in Beijing. Jiang states that, among other things, this was maybe simply just a way to sever relations with the Western powers on the eve of this Boxer war. And the Empress Dowager will, at this same time, get information, which is false, that justifies this expulsion, that justifies the idea that this war can actually be fought and that these moves in preparation for the war actually make sense. She receives a letter from the officer who was guarding the Dagu forts against the Westerners. She'd received a letter that they had shown up and that tensions were high, but she didn't know what actually concluded. This new report says that these forts at Dagu haven't actually fallen, that the Boxers are helping out a lot, and that the resistance is strong, and that, these Westerners are bound to turn around, but they'll reassemble troops and fire back at us soon. So you should send out more troops to help me. Meanwhile, we know that these forts have fallen days ago, and also that the concessions that were being besieged in Tianjin have escaped, and they have gotten out and are making their way towards Beijing. But whatever was on the Empress's mind, it had little effect on Baron von Kettler. right? Clemens von Kettler, as we referred to him earlier in this story. This is the German minister who took it upon himself to capture a boxer and basically torture him in response to the rebels feeling so confident in themselves. He's feeling rather confident in himself the morning after this ultimatum is received by the delegations, informing them that they have to leave Beijing. He is incensed that the Chinese have not responded to this request for a meeting, and he says they should take it all upon themselves to march over to this administrative building where foreign policy in China is handled and demand that the meeting take place. The rest of the foreign ministers from France, Britain, the United States, they're not on board. They think it's dangerous. He decides that it's the right time to make this trip, even if these cowardly Brits and Americans won't join him. This meeting that all of these ministers are taking part in, that Baron von Kettler is using to call them cowards because they're not demanding that the Chinese hold this meeting ends at around 9:30, and at 10 o'clock, all of the ministers and diplomats reconvene, where they notice the absence of Baron von Kettler. He, along with one of the other German diplomats, has decided to make their way to go convince the Chinese to hold this meeting. They've left without the German legation guards. Not long after Kettler's absence is noted, one of the Chinese working at this legation comes running down the street saying he's been shot dead. This confirms the deep-seated fears inside the legation. They think it's now obvious that if they're going to leave the city with an imperial Chinese escort, they're going to all be slaughtered just like von Kettler was. Zhang describes the situation as follows, quote, "The death of Baron Kettler sent a shockwave through the foreign community. It appeared that the German minister, in his twisted and reckless way, had made his last point in two ways. On the one hand, the minister was wrong to assume that there was no danger on the streets. On the other, the minister had been right in arguing against the acceptance of the Chinese ultimatum, for the Chinese authorities were not to be trusted. The Chinese were surely well prepared for a massacre. His colleague's decision to accept the ultimatum now appeared totally wrong, if not foolish. Hence the idea of accepting the Chinese escort was tantamount to collective suicide. Kettler's own mistake, it was widely believed, had inadvertently saved the foreigners and the Chinese Christian converts in Beijing. Few within the legations, at the time or with hindsight, doubted the Chinese government's complicity in the presumed murder." End quote. Lanjin Zhang dedicates an entire chapter to exploring how exactly Baron von Kettler might have been killed, because the account given by his fellow minister that joins him on this trip, he ends up surviving. He ends up getting shot, but he makes it back to legation headquarters and gives his account of a Chinese plot to kill von Kettler, and it's widely accepted because there's just no other evidence to the contrary. Like I said, Lanjin Zhang will go through his problems with this minister's account, but for our purposes, we know now that the calculus inside these besieged legations has drastically changed with the death of this German diplomat. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when they don't leave and don't abide by the ultimatum's orders, Imperial forces open fire on the legation. Ronglu, this pro-Western military official in China, is one of two officials who is going to command Imperial forces outside of this besieged legation. And partly because of his doing, we might see less deaths than we might imagine from a 50-day siege, which involves, the amount of shells and bullets that this one does. There are reports that he ordered his men to aim high. And Ronglu is certainly not the only Chinese official and military strategist who is worried about fighting these Western forces. Li Hongzhang and his protege, Yuan Shikai, are also quite hesitant. They don't want any part of engaging these very advanced militaries with their own. And this is all occurring as this 8-nation alliance, who has just taken the Dagu forts and has broken free from Tianjin, is making their way to Beijing with a force of 50,000 men. And as they do, we witness the types of atrocities which you might expect to accompany an open-air, ground force type invasion like this, taking one village by another. We see the types of atrocities which we'll see in the future wars to come around the corner. We see Japanese soldiers that get captured, get stapled up against walls and have their eyes gouged out. We see Western troops beheading Chinese troops. There's also reports of mass rapes. And due to the extreme heat, it's said to be 108 degrees at some point in August of this mission. This Western alliance, much like the Seymour expedition, will take much longer to get to Beijing than they originally expected, and also due to the advances of the Qing dynasty's military. The military had taken up some Western-style reforms, mainly along German lines, over the last 5 years or so. And we have to remember, they're accompanied by these boxers who, whenever you're on a battlefield and you're not afraid of bullets, that gives you some kind of advantage. Yes, you'll lose a lot of men in the process, but it seems as if the Qing dynasty isn't too worried about using these boxers as they've been used in the past, as basically cannon fodder, as evidenced by Robert Coleman's experience at the legation in Beijing. He describes how after these Chinese barricades have grown almost taller than the walls surrounding the legation, he describes how American troops and other troops have to push back these barriers and push back this horde of boxers outside the walls. He writes, quote, "The German and American Marines took possession of the city wall south of their respective legations to prevent the Chinese from bringing their heavy guns too near and too directly able to bear upon the legations. Thrice they were driven back by heavy fire, but they stuck to their task and eventually obtained each position on the wall, the Germans to the east, the Americans to the west, the two positions being about 600 yards apart. The second time they advanced, the Americans took a Colt machine gun with them and, advancing almost to the Chinese barricade, killed several hundred Chinese. The third time, the Americans advanced several hundred yards away and retreated suddenly, as though panic-stricken. This brought the Chinese out from behind their barricades with a rush, when a Colt gun was again turned loose on them and killed 60 more." End quote. And as these battles are taking place and the movement of this eight-nation alliance is bearing down on Beijing, and the siege is seemingly unsuccessful, Cixi is still hunkering down in this pro-war stance. She's executing court officials who are openly, quote, pro-peace. And she won't flee the capital until the day after these Western forces lift the siege in Beijing on August 14th, 1900. On that day, as one missionary described, the legation members listened joyfully, tearfully, hysterically to the welcome roll of artillery and the click, click, click of the sharp-spoken little machine guns. End quote. So as this eight-nation alliance has just made its way into Beijing and has freed the legation quarters, Cixi leaves the city disguised as a peasant, and she gets to watch as Beijing is looted by Westerners. This is something that has become somewhat of a tradition when Western military forces land on Chinese soil. This occurred during the Opium Wars, as well as at the end of this Boxer War. Jonathan Fenby describes what Cixi's experience must have been like as she leaves her imperial palace and makes her way to the countryside to seek refuge. He writes, quote, "As the imperial party was carried through the rough, poor countryside, Cixi saw China as it really was for the first time, and could have noted the contrast between the reality and the lies she'd been fed for so many years about the condition of the nation. A famine which contemporary estimates said killed 2 million people was gripping the region. The plains were deserted, refugees huddled in caves outside of Xi'an. Consumption of cats and dogs, grass and weeds was followed by the appearance of what an American traveler, Francis Nichols, described as, quote, a horrible kind of meatball made of the bodies of human beings, end quote. Cholera and dysentery spread, while men in carts toured the countryside, buying children to be sold as household slaves in more prosperous areas, end quote. Western powers will hold on to Beijing for over a year, and negotiations carried out on the Chinese side by Li Hongzhang will end up persuading him to brutally put down the last remnants of these boxers, and the Chinese will also be forced to pay a huge indemnity, while they get to watch British troops literally hold loot auctions. The British had said that, well, loot is part of what we get in return for doing this, and not just to hone in on the British too much. Each side of this eight-nation alliance will accuse all the others of being the worst actors while in Beijing and looting and killing and committing most of the atrocities, while they themselves, well, they're not really to blame. The British will actually specifically justify this looting, though, in terms of like the laws of war or the rights of war. And this occupation of Beijing will have some interesting side effects, let's say. Louis Bernstein, who has a chapter in the book, The Boxers, China, and the World, describes, well, one, why this hasn't been written too much about, and also some of these side effects I've just mentioned. He writes, quote, "Nothing has been published in the Western language since 1927 about this brief episode in Chinese history. The reason appears obvious. The TPGs, this is the provincial government force which occupies Beijing, the TPG's activities represent a cultural victory of Western imperialism and civilization in China. Because imperialism as a way of life and thought is out of intellectual fashion, Westerners may wish to forget this episode. Because they were militarily and culturally humiliated and forced to learn from their conquerors, the Chinese do not wish to remember it. Nevertheless, it is important because it drastically changed the city's physical shape, showed the imperial government how cities could be turned into money-making machines using modern administrative methods, and was one of the few times foreign powers temporarily occupied, administered, and returned territory to China." End quote. In the context of this Boxer Rebellion, this looting seems like the expected conclusion. However, within the larger context of this century of humiliation, this is something like an exclamation point. Mark Twain, writing about this looting that takes place in Beijing after the Empress Cixi flees, he pens an essay entitled "To the People Sitting in Darkness." And, he goes on to describe some of the letters sent home by British soldiers fighting in the Boer War. This is the war that the British take on in South Africa, and it's quite similar in some ways to the war that's going on in China. We see what it looks like when we have Brits with guns versus men with spears, and Western society is quickly starting to find some of this treatment of indigenous populations unpalatable. Twain describes a letter sent home by a British private after fighting in the Boer War, after he and his regiment take a hill and now stand before these indigenous peoples with life and death hanging in the balance. This British private writes, quote, "We tore up the hill and into the entrenchments, and the Boers saw we had them. So they dropped their guns and went down to their knees and put up their hands clasped and begged for mercy, and we gave it to them with the long spoon." End quote. That long spoon. This is the end of a bayonet, at the end of a rifle. And this British private openly describes sort of a glee he has in taking part in thrusting the end of that bayonet into the bodies of these indigenous peoples fighting for their land. Mark Twain is not the only Westerner who is starting to find all of this behavior despicable. However, none of this will have an effect on certain soldiers who are involved in the occupation of Beijing and involved in the final destruction of whatever Boxers are left on the ground in China. The scenes that unfold are public mass executions of Boxers, beheadings in the street, the rapings of women associated with the Boxer movement. It's a truly appalling time in this century of humiliation. Maybe the apex, if we're going to talk about Western powers doing what they'd like on China's land. At the Boxer War's conclusion, there's tens of thousands of Chinese Christian converts laying dead on the ground, killed by their fellow countrymen because of their conversion to a religion that's alien and customs that are alien to China. There's thousands of Chinese that are also laying dead, killed by Western troops, cleaning up the rest of this Boxer Rebellion and looting. The Imperial Empress has fled the palace, and the Chinese, once negotiations have concluded, are forced to pay over $300 million in what becomes known as the Boxer Protocol, or the Boxer Indemnity. And this $300 million US is split up amongst the various nations which invaded and ultimately took Beijing. But what's interesting here is that this payment of over $300 million to these Western powers will provide an incentive for these Western powers to keep China unified. This has been something that's been discussed throughout the program, this slicing of the melon, or this carving up of China, as a way to establish spheres of influence. This is something that's very popular at the time. in China. So this is going to be pushed aside for a moment, and Western powers are going to be more interested in getting their cash than cutting up China. But something else happens that's quite interesting at the end of this Boxer Rebellion. Cixi returns to Beijing in 1902 after negotiations are over, and she begins to institute many of the reforms that may have helped China 30 years ago. She starts erecting a huge number of modern schools, upwards of 80,000 and hundreds of thousands, and soon by in the next 5 years or so, there are millions of Chinese students who are taking more westernized classes than ever before. Girls are even encouraged to go to school, as well as their parents are instructed to stop the foot binding of women that has been going on for centuries at this point. She orders for the construction of more railroads that will help commerce and the transportation of goods. And also, Cixi tries to mend this divide in her society between Manchus and Han. She will put an end to the decree which says that these peoples can't get married to one another. And the result of all of this, again, is positive for China. If you're going to think that entering the practices of European modernity makes sense for China's future. Novels are written at a pace that China has never seen before. The arts are growing. Western science is now more and more popular, and there's more interest ever than before. And part of the reason she can do this at all is because many of these pro-Boxer conservative officials who have encouraged her over the past couple years to align the imperial forces with the Boxer forces, they're gone. Some have committed suicide, some have fled, some have been exiled. So she won't have these bulwarks in the way. But it's not like Li Hongzhang, that great modernizer, not necessarily a westernizer, right? He still likes the idea of an emperor or an empress on the throne. Well, he's not around either. He dies very shortly after the negotiations end, which formulate this Boxer protocol. So Cixi, does make a number of declarative statements in public that show her full support for this movement. There will even be hesitant talks of a future potential constitutional monarchy in China, something that would have been unthinkable a mere 50 years ago. And the thing she'll do that will strike at the core of the Confucian ideology which runs through Chinese politics is to abolish the civil service examination, the one that emphasizes Confucius a great deal, and historical analysis of Chinese documents. These are going to be replaced basically by colleges, which are now, like I said, going to forward this idea of science being much more important than it ever has in the past, specifically Western science, which for anyone who's interested in science themselves is a sort of interesting concept. But all of these things will take place, and the Americans will do basically what they did the first time we see a modernizing movement take place. When these self-strengtheners took the helm of China's forward march, let's say, after the Taiping Rebellion, we see the Americans turning away from the Chinese and sending back workers and imprisoning workers, and we see uprisings of mobs in the street in America. There are a lot of similarities between that time and what happens after this Boxer Protocol is signed. Right around the time it's signed, President McKinley will be shot and killed by an assassin, and Theodore Roosevelt will take the presidency. He's someone who very openly is far more pro-Japanese than Chinese. I believe he referred to them one time as rabbits. And he's very taken with samurai culture and the culture of the Japanese as being superior to that of the Chinese. In 1904, the U.S. Congress will extend indefinitely this Chinese Exclusion Act. And soon after, in Shanghai, the Chinese will encourage its peoples not to buy American goods. So I think we should take a moment to recap this dysfunctional relationship between the United States and China thus far in this century of humiliation. After the disastrous Taiping Rebellion, which leaves probably more than 20 million Chinese dead, the Chinese will take on a number of reforms in an effort to modernize their country, which ostensibly is something you'd think the Western powers would want. The United States, Britain, France, all of these countries are interested in getting China to open up its doors, not just commercially, but somewhat culturally as well. If you want to be able to have your goods do well within any particular population, you'd like that population to have a culture which would let itself be receptive to these types of products. But in both instances, both after this Taiping Rebellion and then after this Boxer Protocol is signed at the end of the Boxer Rebellion, the United States makes a clear turn away from China. And this new turn will coincide with the rise of a new generation of Chinese thinkers, reformists, politicians, and military strategists. This is the generation that Mao Zedong, Chiang Kai-Shek, Zhou Enlai, and Lin Biao all come from. They'll have the opportunity during their formative years to watch American action and their response to China, and they can formulate their own opinion about how the U.S. is likely to act on China's behalf. A reformist who can be lumped into this category, into this generation, who is interested in a constitutional monarchy named Liang Qichao, he's made his way to America just after this Boxer Rebellion concludes. And after touring America and seeing its style of freedom and its style of governance, he comes to some conclusions about the future of China. The following comes from Jonathan Pomfret's The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom, and within this passage I'm about to read are a number of Liang's quotes that Pomfret relates. Pomfret writes, quote, Liang believed that for China to regain its lost glory, the nature of the, quote, Chinese character had to change. But as he visited Chinese communities in 28 American cities over the course of 7 months, he turned away from the idea of a constitutional monarchy or democracy as the remedy for China's ills. Liang became disenchanted with his fellow Chinese. They were too insular, loyal only to their families, not to a state. Quote, we have a village mentality, he complained, not a national mentality. Democracy in China, he predicted, would mean, quote, national suicide. What the Chinese needed, he wrote, was someone to rule them with, quote, iron and fire, to forge and temper our countrymen for 20, 30, even 50 years. After that, we can give them books of Rousseau and tell them about the deeds of Washington. With sadness, Liang abandoned his dream of a constitutional monarchy. Quote, the Chinese people can only be governed autocratically, he declared. They cannot enjoy freedom. End quote. However, Liang's take will be a lot different from that of another reformist, one who is more democratically minded, named Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen will be the first president of the Chinese Republic when it finally comes about a decade later. And Sun Yat-sen has been working in what he calls the Revived China Society, a sort of secret society which aims to bring about democracy in China, or at least some form of democracy. He's another member of this new generation of Chinese thinkers. But what's important about Sun Yat-sen is that he's about as westernized as you can get and still call yourself, a native of China. He spends a lot of time in Hawaii. He has a brother that lives on the island, and he knows English fluently, another thing that sets him apart from many of these other reformers. And he has a lot of connections throughout the globe. We'll see Sun Yat-sen become a more and more important figure in this century of humiliation, and one that is potentially the most progressive, and progressive to a point that leads to failure, as we'll see. But Sun Yat-sen, reformists, and other progressives will still have to sort of battle against this older generation of Chinese thinking, which is still pervasive in China at this point in history when Cixi takes on these new reforms. As these new reforms are taken on, we see what we saw before the Boxer Rebellion. We see a number of catastrophes, natural catastrophes, that make these reforms to some Chinese peoples seem like they've disturbed the harmony that exists on Earth. There's a number of uprisings across China in the first decade of the 20th century, and it might be hard to say that these are directly in response to these reforms. Certainly some of these uprisings are, but a lot of them have to do with the working conditions in these factories that are being erected. Some others have to do with, churches and Westerners, still some of these problems that existed during the Boxer Rebellion. So on both sides of this sort of spectrum we have in Chinese politics, the conservatives and the progressives, we have problems and a dissatisfaction with the current rule. And there's another problem surrounding these reforms. This is the problem that China doesn't really have the money it needs to undertake them. So, predictably, taxes will go up. And not only to pay for these reforms, but also to pay off this Boxer indemnity. So within this context of the Century of Humiliation, how does this look? The fact that, these Westerners have come in and now we have to divert our funds from our pockets and away from our industry building to these Western pockets. And then pile this on top of it, this fact that what will be used as collateral sometimes to pay off this Boxer indemnity or to pay off the loans, which China will then use to pay off this Boxer indemnity, is that they will put up railroads and huge industrial projects that Westerners can undertake for themselves, thus eliminating many of the new jobs which could be offered to Chinese citizens, but are instead offered to Westerners. So with Westerners receiving the right to take on a lot of these industrial projects, the gentry class in China is dissatisfied. They want to be the ones that take the reins of this modernizing movement. And people flooding into Chinese cities also want a place to work. And from their vantage point, it seems like the only people that have money are these Westerners and the Qing dynasty, which produces another anti-Manchu backlash. We have to remember this Han-Manchu divide within Chinese society still. In 1905, a teenager from Sichuan publishes a book which has a first passage that reads like this, quote, "Sweep away thousands of years of despotism, cast off thousands of years of slavishness, exterminate the 5 million bestial Manchus, wash away the humiliation of 260 years of oppression and sorrow, cruelty and tyranny, turn the Chinese soil into a clean land, and all the sons and grandsons of the Yellow Emperor into George Washingtons. Then we may rise from death and return to life, retrieve our souls, come out of the 18th layer of hell, and ascend to the 33rd level of heaven." End quote. So these industrial efforts will not do what the Qing dynasty wants them to do. It won't help unify China. When we listen to that quote we just read, we have to keep in the back of our minds the fact that the Boxers had just been quelled, just 5 years ago. A movement of peasants who are highly superstitious, highly conservative, xenophobic, and hell-bent on eliminating all foreign religion. And now we have this very progressive movement in the youth of China. We've already seen throughout this program divides along ethnic lines. We've talked about divides along linguistic lines as well. Well, now we're seeing generational divides. This is nothing new for any society. As much as Westerners of this time period want to describe China's culture and population as stagnant or backwards, it would be impossible to think that new generations don't come up with new ideologies, even with this Confucian turn to the past that has held sway in China for so long. But these new, young protesters who are looking to democratize China or westernize China, well, they're going to have more fervor than any of the past generations who thought anything similar to this. And again, democracy is such a new idea that really anything similar in the past you could point to would be either a religious uprising or an uprising which seeks to supplant the current head of the dynasty, the current emperor or empress, with a new emperor or empress who has the mandate of heaven. Well, now we're talking about constitutional monarchies and parliaments if you're Sun Yat-sen. This is quite a new change. But internal problems within China are not the only problems that exist. Even if Cixi is going to, allow for the marriage between these two different populations, the Han and the Manchu, and is going to call for the end of foot binding and the construction of schools, railroads, mines, none of this is going to stop Japan and Russia from bickering over Korea and Manchuria. We've spent time talking about both these areas. China and Japan went to war over one of them. They went to war over Korea in 1894 and 1895 in the First Sino-Japanese War, which, as we can remember, ended in the crushing defeat of China and the rise to eminence of Japan. But even if Japan has demonstrated for the Western world what they're capable of, the Russians still aren't recognizing it for themselves. And perhaps this is because of what happens at the end of the First Sino-Japanese War, right? This is the war that ends with the treaty signed at Shimonoseki, which, gets brought on because Li Hongzhang gets shot in the face by a would-be assassin, and the Japanese are looking quite bad on the international stage, so they come to the table quite early. Well, Japan had made off with some territories at the end of that war, and they held a certain claim over Korean politics that the Chinese once had. However, we also have to remember that Russia, Germany, and France will step in after they get word that this treaty's been signed. They step in and essentially say, no, you're not. You're not signing this treaty. We're going to take these lands that you've conquered and taken from China and had them sign away for you, right? The Chinese had signed these territories over to the Japanese. And Russia, Germany, and France will basically say, no, we're taking them. And they do. And Japan gets to watch all of this. Now, while Japan won't get these territories in Manchuria or Korea that they were looking for, a number of also relevant ports surrounding China, but they will get this Chinese indemnity paid to them, and they'll be using this money to fund their military. The Japanese also get to watch the Russians build and almost finish this enormous Trans-Siberian Railroad. And as they're looking at this, they can only imagine the types of supplies and troops which could be sent across this railroad and the access that it gives them all across Asia. But what really sets off Japan after the First Sino-Japanese War is a slow Russian incursion into Korean politics. And this is being supported by other actors in Europe. Kaiser Wilhelm II will actually verbatim say, we're going to make Korea Russian, and that it's the Russian Tsar Nicholas II's job to basically stop Asian hordes from spilling into Europe, as if it was still the 13th century. Politicians of the time, somewhat like Kaiser Wilhelm, were calling this the Yellow Peril. Soon after the Boxer War in November of 1902, Kaiser Wilhelm sends a letter to his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II. We have to remember, we're still dealing with this interrelated network of kings and czars and emperors who are cousins at this time in Europe, right? So this is Kaiser Wilhelm II sending a letter to his cousin, Tsar Nicholas. And he here relates his vision of what Asia could look like in the near future. He writes the following, quote, 20 to 30 million Chinese, supported by a half-dozen Japanese divisions, led by competent, intrepid Japanese officers full of hatred for Christianity, that is a vision of the future that cannot be contemplated without concern, and it is not impossible. On the contrary, it is the realization of the Yellow Peril, which I described a few years ago, and I was ridiculed by the majority of people for my graphic depiction of it. Your devoted friend and cousin, Willie, Admiral of the Atlantic. End quote. So ever since the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan has gotten to watch Russia use and capitalize on the territory that they thought they'd won during that war. And, they were prepared to allow for this to continue. It's only once Russia starts, meddling with Korean politics and starts pushing Japan out of Korean economics and commercial spheres. And also, once this Boxer War is over and Russia is slow to get out of the territory that they've, taken during its trip to Beijing to free these foreigners from the legations, they're slow to get out of that territory now, too. And Japan, well, they're ready to go to war. And it's not as if the two sides didn't see war coming. There are multiple negotiations and instances where Japanese and Russian diplomats will sit across the table from one another and try to hammer out an agreement. But none of these negotiations get anywhere. And finally, in February of 1904, the Japanese open up the Russo-Japanese War with a torpedo attack on a Russian ship. Being that this war doesn't directly affect China, they're not one of the main parties involved, we're going to skip over some of the more relevant events, but we will stick to the story as it relates to China. As the Russo-Japanese War continues, the Russians get beaten back and demoralized, and it becomes harder and harder for them to send men to the front. The seeds of the future Russian Revolution are planted by this point in history, and social and economic tensions are making this war impossible. They're looking to sit down to the table. But the Chinese do one thing that will have some consequences for its citizens living in Manchuria. The Chinese will offer help to the Japanese. They see their military position as most favorable, and this strategy of playing one barbarian against another involves trying to keep either one out as long as possible. And while the Japanese won't actually take the Chinese up on this offer, the Russians will get wind of it, and brutal treatment of Chinese civilians in Manchuria by Russian troops has made its way down through the records. But what also comes down on the Japanese side of their action in Manchuria is the co-opting of bandits, right? We've talked about bandits before during this Boxer Rebellion. It's sort of the seeds of the Boxer Rebellion. We have disaffected young men out of work in areas that have a poor crop yield, and these men turn to basically looting and holding up carts of goods that are making its way across the country. Well, the quelling of the Boxer Rebellion didn't mean the elimination of all bandits. They still exist further north than Beijing, and in some instances, they've gotten more powerful and larger and well-armed. The Japanese will co-opt one of the more powerful bandit lords living in Manchuria, a man who will become one of the most powerful warlords for a stretch of time in the world. His name was Jiang Zuolin, or as we'll begin to refer to him later on in the show, he's known as the Old Marshal. He'll help the Japanese carry out guerrilla warfare campaigns in Manchuria, and his men will get more and more experience on the battlefield, more arms, more training, and they'll begin to plant themselves in North China. At the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt will be the one that will get the two sides to sit down at the negotiating table. And he has a couple of interests himself in hammering out this agreement. He wants to keep the spheres of influence balanced in Asia. He has the same fears that many other U.S. politicians have had over the last century, that China will be slowly annexed by European powers, and European powers will use that land and whatever profit they'd get off that land to destroy other European powers. So Japan will get more influence, or rather get its influence back in Korea. This is recognized in the treaty. Russia's supposed to stay out. And also Russia has to evacuate Manchuria. In exchange for this, the Russians are not forced to pay any kind of indemnity to the Japanese. Even though this is the first instance in recent memory of an Asian power beating a European power on the battlefield, Europe will turn itself inward and focus on itself and its fellow surrounding countries at the conclusion of this war. Russia's defeat, and being that they're allies with France, creates a situation for Germany that they think they can exploit. They've wanted to hammer the French for years now, and with their greatest ally now having just lost a battle to the Japanese, well, this is going to encourage the Germans. And on the Japanese side, well, you're going to see a lot of dissatisfaction with the treaty that gets signed at Portsmouth. There's going to be a lot of calls for more territorial gains in Manchuria, and the fact that Russia doesn't have to pay an indemnity, well, this doesn't go over well with many of the ultra-nationalists inside Japan. We have to remember that Japan has felt themselves slighted constantly by these European powers. Japan had its doors knocked down by European powers in ships with guns, and they've opened up their commercial industry to them. And like we've said, they've tried to modernize and westernize much faster than any other power in Asia. And what have they gotten in return for it? Well, they've gotten this triple intervention that occurs at the end of the First Sino-Japanese War, and now they think that they've gotten slighted again. by Theodore Roosevelt and the Americans, and they see a European coalition emerge that wants to work against them at all costs. This will be crucial to the ideology that emerges in Japan over the course of the next decades, that ends up leading to its invasion of China and its war of disastrous overextension. So in the past, China has been able to rely on Western powers and their mutual interest in China's commercial atmosphere. But now, with them all concentrated on what's going on in Europe and the build-up to World War I, they're going to lose sight of Asia, and thus lose sight of Japan and their interest in China. And with the Qing dynasty still weak, though reforming, right? We've talked about Cixi taking on these reforms before this Russo-Japanese war breaks out. The empire will have its last moments of decay soon after Cixi dies in 1908. Cixi will pass after poisoning to death the Emperor Guangxu, who we've discussed in the past. This is the emperor that she placed on the throne when he was 4 or 5 years old, and that she removes from the throne after he undertook the 100 Days of Reform in 1898 on the eve of the Boxer Rebellion. So after he is poisoned, it's said that he was on his way out and dying as is, and that she actually just wanted to make sure she lived longer than he did. This was something she was particularly interested in. So after she poisons him, she will pass herself, and just before she passes, she manages to place yet a third infant on the throne, right? This is what she did right when she took power. She has the dying Jiangfang emperor back in, during the days of the Taiping Rebellion. She had him place on the throne her son, who was only a few years old. And then later, she has the Guangxu emperor placed on the throne at the age of 4 or 5. Well, now as she leaves, she has another infant placed on the throne, ostensibly to retain her status if she were to go on living. But like we said, she dies. And as she leaves the scene, she leaves behind many fractured pieces and a bit of advice for the future of the dynasty. Her last words were said to be the following. Cixi's dying breath included, quote, "Never again allow any woman to hold the supreme power in the state. It is against the house law of our dynasty and should be strictly forbidden. Be careful not to permit eunuchs to meddle in government matters." End quote. Cixi, an interesting character in history and fascinating in terms of what she's able to do at the administrative level as someone who started out as a concubine. Even this last quote relates something to us that we haven't had a chance to really discuss in our show today, and this is her use of eunuchs. I encourage anyone out there listening to go and pick up a book and find out more about this fascinating woman in Chinese history and honestly in the history of the world. Historians are divided on how exactly to interpret the Empress Cixi's legacy. On one hand, we have revisionist historians like William Rowe and Zhong Chang, who have both recently written histories of this period in time, one focusing on the Great Qing Dynasty, that's William Rowe, and the other focusing on Cixi's life and time and power more specifically, that would be Chang. These historians will point to the fact that, well, what do you expect Cixi to do in the setting that she operated in? This is something I called our attention to, I believe, in the first episode. I was talking about Cixi potentially having embezzled funds from the military. Now, this isn't a skillful move for any empress or emperor, but at the same time, what other moves could she have actually made without losing the mandate of heaven? We have to remember that, she does oust her nephew from the throne, the Guangxu emperor, in 1898 because of this 100 Days of Reform that he undertakes. And if we can remember, she doesn't actually seem as concerned with the reforms as she is with the way these reforms are being implemented, or how fast they're being implemented. And we also have to remember that after this Boxer Rebellion is quelled and Cixi returns to the throne, well, she begins to institute many of these same policies that she ousted her nephew for. So many historians like Jonathan Fenby and John King Fairbank, who will criticize Cixi for not instituting the types of reforms that could have helped China out, Well, it will mainly be the timing here. And at this point, we have to think again, at what point could she have done this? At what point could she have made this turn to the West, given what other Western powers were doing throughout the 20th and 19th century? When could this have happened? And I'm not saying it couldn't have, it's just worth exploring and thinking about. But the thing that rings completely true to me is that Cixi's handling of the Boxers was terrible and had lasting consequences for the Qing dynasty and future China. The indemnity that they'll have to pay will go right into the pockets of the forces which will confront China most violently in the near future. However Cixi's final legacy will be told, one of her last acts as Empress of China is to place on the throne, or as heir of the throne, yet another infant. This infant's name was Puyi. And when Cixi and the Emperor Guangxu dies, he takes the throne at the age of 2. And the tale of this young boy's coronation ceremony that historians relate sounds fascinating. We have this 2-year-old being carried by his father through a crowd screaming in excitement with loud drums beating in the background and the boys crying. A just metaphor as China is about to head into an unknown place, both politically and socially. The upheavals that China will face in the coming decades will lead to the birth of a new nation. Unfortunately, though, for Puyi, he won't be around to have much to do with it. Warlords and Republicans and communists will descend upon China. We'll cover this period in part 3 of our series on the Century of Humiliation.